All right. Well, welcome everyone to the workshop to identify national ocean exploration priorities in the Pacific. We're going to get started momentarily, but first we just wanted to review some virtual workshop meeting logistics as reminders. A lot of this has been communicated through email already, but we just want to repeat that this meeting will be recorded and later shared with COL staff as well as NOAA staff, so please keep that in mind. You all are doing a fantastic job at keeping your mics muted, but yeah, we'll ask that you continue to keep your mic muted unless you're actively speaking. We're asking participants to please keep your cameras on as much as possible, and observers, we're asking that you please keep your cameras off at this time. If you are unfamiliar with GoToMeeting, there's a drop-down menu at the center top of your screen where there's options to view everyone, to view who's talking, active cameras, or hide everyone. It's a little overwhelming with 68 people on the screen, so you can change it to either active cameras only or who is talking to see who is actually talking at the time. If you have any connection issues, we recommend that you call in via the dial-in information as a backup. We've had really good luck getting higher quality audio through that mechanism. We just want to say that the agenda is a guiding document, and we want to maintain the right to have a little bit of flexibility to have deep discussions into the topics that are of great interest to the group. We're going to be having you ask questions to the presenters via the chat log. So at the top right of your screen, you'll see a little chat bubble, and you can click on that. At the bottom of the chat view, there's an option to send messages to organizers only. So any questions that you have for presenters throughout their presentations, you can submit questions to the COL organizers by doing that. And we will keep a log of all the questions and answer as many as we can throughout the workshop, and specifically during the Q&A sessions today. We want to make sure that we save all workshop logistics questions for the last final Q&A in the last 15 to 30 minutes of the meeting today. The first two Q&As are more focused on the content, so please keep that in mind. We're going to do our best to answer all of the questions, but of course we're going to have limited time. So we do invite you to email your breakout leaders, to email the moderator of the workshop, Jamie Austin, Dr. Jamie Austin, and we'll be happy to answer your questions at a later time if we don't get to it today. And finally, we just really appreciate your patience. Obviously, we had originally intended to do this meeting in person, and we really appreciate everyone's flexibility in experiencing this new virtual format for this type of meeting. And if you have any technical issues and need any questions answered, COL staff member Haley French is happy to work with you. I'm going to post her email address in the chat log to everyone right now. So if any time throughout the meeting today you have an issue with GoToMeeting, you can email her and ask her questions. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to COL President and CEO Admiral John White to get us started.
Dan, thank you very much. I'm going to be brief because I want to get Admiral Tim Gallaudet on as soon as possible. First of all, it is an honor for us to work with NOAA and put this workshop on. This topic of ocean exploration is crucially important to all the members of our consortium, many of whom are represented here in this meeting and will be represented throughout the workshop in coming weeks. Since I first got really engaged in ocean exploration after listening to a guy named Bob Ballard about 20-something years ago in a presentation at the Naval Observatory, I have been hugely engaged and really looking forward to a day like this day, where ocean exploration is at the forefront of moving forward in ocean science and all of ocean matters going forward. That is a credit largely to Admiral Gallaudet, but also to all of you. The visionary leadership and just the excitement, enthusiasm, and working hard to put us where we are now and set the stage for a future for ocean exploration that I'm much excited about. Is really a credit to Tim and all of you. So without any further ado, Tim, thank you for joining us, and please, the floor is yours.
Hey, John and team, it's great to be here, and thank you, John, for hosting this really important event. And Jamie, thank you also for stepping up here and supporting what I am really excited to help you promote and move forward. So just a couple things. There's so much happening in this realm of ocean exploration that, I mean, you're gonna have to, like, yank me off the stage right now, because there's so much I want to share. But first off, let's look at the geostrategic picture. The Indo-Pacific is hot right now. The National Security Council is pushing with the DoD an Indo-Pacific strategy and the implementation of it through a variety of campaign plans, all of which NOAA is a part of. They include plans for the South China Sea, the Pacific Island countries, and the freely associated states, as well as Indonesia. And the work we did in Capstone in earlier years is something we want to repeat, and is going to show really well in terms of a whole of government approach to the Indo-Pacific. So that's one. Second is, of course, we all know about the presidential memorandum on ocean mapping, exploration, and characterization in the EEZ, and what's followed from that so well. And we have completed our national strategy. We've completed the Alaska coastal mapping strategy, and we have completed the set of recommendations to increase the efficiency of permitting for ocean exploration, mapping, and characterization activities. And right now, the Ocean Research Management Committee is working on the implementation plan for that set of recommendations. We just met yesterday on it. So that's super exciting. And then look at what's happening now. And John White wrote this very eloquently in a recent op-ed about how the blue economy is going to be foundational to the recovery of our national economy. And we all know that in this room to be true. And there's so much about it, which is really exciting. I mean, blue tech is growing. I saw a recent industry report that said all the areas of manufacturing in the US, they listed the top 10, and number 3 was manufacturing AUVs, second only to hydrofracking equipment and 3D printing. Think about that. So that's definitely a big part of our recovery, is going to be the work we do and the technology we employ. And then, of course, there's other aspects of it, like sustainable fisheries, minerals extraction, pharmaceuticals, non-renewable, renewable wind energy is growing, and even hydrokinetic and hydrothermal power sources are going to be increasing in the future. So those are opportunities as we seek to recover during the pandemic. And then I want to really highlight something also interesting that the pandemic has brought to sort of bear, and that is the future of ocean seagoing science in the 21st century. The nature of what we do in ocean exploration involving robotics, autonomous underwater vehicles, as well as telepresence, we're going to see more and more of. So we have really, through OER and our partners, set the standard for the future of seagoing science. COVID's not going away soon. We're going to have limited manning on our crews, and having these kind of technologies along with artificial intelligence is the way ahead. So more importance for the work we're going to do. And then, I think something also neat is building on the successes of our Oceanus Explorer over the last 10 years and 100 expeditions. We have started to increase our partnerships. We made partnerships with Ocean Infinity, Ocean X, Vulcan, Schmidt Ocean Institute, and Caladan Oceanic. And a great example of the power of the partnerships is happening right now. Caladan, with Victor Vescovo, has been mapping the Challenger Deep and the Marianas area of our EEZ, while our NOAA ships still remain pierside. They're getting ready to get underway, but that partnership has helped us really understand more and map a vital part of what the presidential memorandum directed us to do. And so, lastly, I'll kind of close and say what's also important is the new discoveries that we've made every year, and we're seeing more and more of. And I was shared by Craig McLean's team a recent article that was published this week about a new species of marine sponge that was found during a 2017 Oceanus Explorer mission in the Pacific with NOAA fishery scientists. And there we go, we're playing the video there. And scientists from the National Systematics Lab. And this new sponge is called the Adhena magnifica, or magnificent alien. And how interesting is that? NASA is spending billions, really, of dollars a year to go to alien worlds like Mars and the Moon. And meanwhile, we have these alien life forms right within our own oceans, ripe for discovery. So let me just thank you all for participating in this incredibly important work. It's great to be a partner with you and a teammate, and I look forward to the results of the workshop. Thank you and take care.
All right, Tim, thank you very much for those inspiring remarks and video. Again, I think you put it very good and or put it very well and succinctly about the really the exciting times in front of us. So what I'm going to do now is just introduce the members of the COL team who really are part of this effort in this workshop. First of all, you heard from Dan Rogers. He and Katie Fillingham are going to be leading this workshop session, or the plenary session that we are doing now. And they're going to be co-moderating, co-facilitating the presentations and the Q&A. In addition, we have Kristen Urinsik, who is our Vice President of Research and Education, Alex Hocroft, who's our intern, wearing a tie and outdressing all of us, and Haley French, who's going to be also working behind the scenes to make sure everything goes smoothly. So thanks to all of you as a team for this. And again, with that, I'll just say that our consortium is fully committed to pushing forward with this workshop. I would much rather be doing this in person as we had originally planned, although I know that a lot of you are glad to see me only as a little icon on the screen. I'm much younger that way, by the way. And but you know, I think we missed something by not being in person, being able to have the offline types of conversations that are so important in this work. However, we're going to do what we can. We're going to do the best. We have a great team with Jamie, the leadership of NOAA, to make sure we get what we need, and that we're going to hopefully just really advance this effort going forward. So with that, I would like to turn it over to Dr. Jamie Austin, who is really the overall leader, facilitator, and moderator of this effort. And I think has led us to a lot of really good success, as we've had to really shift our rudder in midstream to do it virtually. Just thanks a lot, Jamie, for your hard work, your years of just your scientific brilliance and leadership. And it's great to have you really steering us in the right direction. So over to you, sir.
It's a rare privilege to follow two admirals in any venue. And Dan, if you want to queue up my slides, that would be great.
We'll have it up momentarily, Jamie.
Yep. Many of you know me. Been around a long time, not as long as Dr. Ballard, although Dr. Ballard and I were students together once upon a time in the summer of 1974 at Woods Hole Oceanographic. Many of you were not born in 1974. I am the moderator of this. I have spent the last 42 years at the University of Texas Institute for Geophysics, but I'm spending a little time these days helping Alan Leonardi as a rotator at the NOAA Office of Ocean Exploration and Research. And it's been my privilege over the last few months to participate in this effort. As the admirals introduced, we're here to identify national ocean exploration priorities in the Pacific. This is a consortium or a partnership of the Consortium of Ocean Leadership, Admiral White and Alan Leonardi, the director of the NOAA Office of Ocean Exploration and Research. And I want to call out here the team. Admiral White's called them out before. I want to call them out again. Dan, Kristen, Katie, Alex, Haley. It's simply a fact that we had originally, and next slide, Dan. We had originally talked about having this workshop in March and April, but we're having it now. Many of you have been to many workshops, but I guarantee you will never be at a longer workshop. This workshop is going to take place over more than 2 months, so be excited about that. So where are we here? I wanted to go through a bit of history first. We've been to the Pacific for a while now, and we're headed back. That's what this workshop's all about. A lot of this got started in 2014 at a workshop in San Francisco hosted by the Ocean Exploration Trust, Bob Ballard and Company. Telepresence-enabled exploration of the Eastern Pacific Ocean, and the white papers submitted prior to that meeting have been and are available for this workshop. Prepping for this workshop, which was originally an in-person event in late March and early April, also generated about 40 white papers. That original workshop resulted in a lot of activity. Admiral Gallaudet mentioned the Capstone program, the campaign to address Pacific monument science, technology, and ocean needs. That was an extraordinarily successful set of expeditions by the Okeanos Explorer, by the Ocean Exploration Trust, and by the Schmidt Ocean Institute. And now we have other organizations, as Admiral Gallaudet mentioned, working hard in the Pacific, and you've got a small map of the Capstone program there on that slide. And we've been, for the last 5 years or so, working in the Pacific, and it's to regenerate those batteries and get us going primarily in the U.S. exclusive economic zone, but in prepping potentially for a national ocean exploration program that we're here right now. Next slide, Dan. The Admiral mentioned the Presidential Memorandum on Ocean Mapping of the United States, EEZ, and the shoreline and near shore of Alaska. That presidential memorandum came out in November of 2019. It seems like a million years ago now, given what's happened since. I want to call attention to two pieces of that memo. To improve our nation's understanding of the vast ocean resources and to advance the economic, security, and environmental interests of the U.S., it's the policy of this country to support the conservation, management, and balanced use of America's oceans by exploring, mapping, and characterizing the U.S. EEZ. Bob Ballard's called this Submerged America, including mapping the Arctic and subarctic shoreline and near shore of Alaska, and that's why we're here. Within 180 days of that memorandum, the Ocean Policy Committee, working through the Ocean Science and Technology Subcommittee, and in coordination with the administrator of NOAA, was going to and has developed a national strategy to map the US EEZ and mapping priority areas within the US EEZ. Next slide, Dan. That national strategy has just come out. The cover of that strategy is there and it's available. Ideally, the report from this workshop, should we have had this workshop in person at COL in late March, early April, would have preceded publication of the national strategy. But we can now use the national strategy to help guide us in our workshop discussions between now and September. If you look at that national strategy, it's got 5 primary goals: coordinating interagency efforts and resources to map the US EEZ, exploring and characterizing priority areas within that EEZ, developing and maturing technologies to do those tasks within the EEZ, and ultimately identifying and maturing partnerships to do the same things. You will see a complete consonance in what we are trying to do in this workshop and what the national strategy would like to do in the Pacific. And I'm hoping that we can sneak up here this group of people on a national program using the Pacific as an example of what will work. Next slide, Dan. As I said, the original workshop was supposed to be an in-person exercise. We had gone a long way down the road to having this workshop in DC at COL in late March, early April. We had about 40 people lined up. We had tremendous representation from federal agencies, academia, the private sector, and as I said, we had 40 white papers detailing desired areas and topics for OE activities in the Pacific. And as I said, in addition to the availability of white papers for the 2014 workshop, as we all know, events happened to prevent that. We then evolved through the hard efforts of the COL team, what we are calling a hybrid model, which is being kicked off by this event, this plenary, this virtual plenary, followed by a series of virtual breakout discussions over the next 2 months, which we have arranged broadly by discipline. We'll talk about that shortly, that are going to take place in July and August. And what we originally thought would be a final in-person event in September to wrap up those discussions and to be framing a report, which we hope will be in approximately October. It's looking increasingly as though an in-person event in September is going to be unlikely. So we're pretty much announcing here that in-person event will be replaced by another virtual exercise sometime in September. exact dates to be determined, but approximately mid-September. You know, the good news through all this is that the enthusiasm of you all has been fantastic. We actually have more participants on this call than we had originally lined up for the in-person event. We've got about 60. We haven't sacrificed expertise and diversity of background, and we have a lot of observers from NOAA, OER, and so on sitting in on this plenary in addition to that. And I want to thank you on behalf of NOAA, OER, and COL. Bravo to all of you. Do a clap for yourselves, because if we weren't getting buy-in, many of you have been involved in many workshops. A lot of the gravitas of any workshop, any report, is who participated and who contributed to the report. And we just have an outstanding group of people here. Next slide, Dan. Following today's plenary, we're going to conduct 5 virtual breakout discussions over the next couple of months. We have identified 10 breakout leaders in 5 general subject areas: biology, Amanda Demopoulos from the USGS. She's also a member of the Ocean Exploration Advisory Board, and Dave Wagner from Conservation International. Seafloor, Larry Mayer, who is as well known as Bob Ballard, I think, from CCOM UNH, and Dave Miller from FUGRO. Water column characterization, Mike Vecchione from NOAA National Marine Fisheries and the Smithsonian. Dr. Squid and Nicole Reno from the Ocean Exploration Trust. Marine Resources, Jeremy Potter, who formerly was at NOAA OER and now is with the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management, and Ruth Perry from Shell. And Cultural Heritage, Jim Delgado from Search, also formerly from NOAA, and Cameron Hume, the current chair of the Ocean Exploration Advisory Board and a former ambassador to 3 different countries. He is our government reality check guy for all this. Each of these groups will be reporting out here shortly in the plenary, and then we'll talk about timing for all these discussions at the end of the plenary. In addition to the breakout co-leads, each discussion group has already been allocated approximately 12 participants to make these discussions cogent. They're going to take place over two 2-hour periods in separate days over the next 2 months. And along with those participants, we're going to have observers from NOAA, OER, and other spots. Each breakout discussion is going to focus on what the national strategy wants us to do in the Pacific, what we should do, how desired mapping and characterization is going to take place, the technologies new and maturing that we want to use, and ultimately the partnerships that exist and that we envision. And we hope to sneak up on the facets of a national OE program as well, and we'll see how we do with that. Each discussion is going to be summarized in writing in preparation for that wrap-up session in September. And the great thing about virtual meetings is that we can have as many of these discussions between now and September as these discussion groups need. That's one of the great things about it. Our travel costs drop, our ability to interact increases. Admiral White's right. You will never, I'm an old white guy, you will never replace face-to-face. There's something wonderful about that, not including alcohol consumption. But in fact, it's a wonderful, wonderful thing to have the flexibility to have multiple meetings to iron out reports as we move ahead. Next slide, Dan, please. September meeting. We're going to hear and discuss results from the breakouts. We're going to get updates on the status of OE funding based upon continued deliberations based on the national strategy. We're going to consider inclusive and equitable partnerships in the Pacific, and I'm going to give a talk about that later on in the plenary. And we're going to discuss the format and content of the workshop report and decide on a timeline for its development and publication. I think that's it. Next slide, Dan. Yeah. So we have a little time, I think, for some Q&A. This is a good time to stop for a second and take a few questions if there are any. If not, we'll move on.
Yeah, so I'll just remind everyone that you can submit questions via the chat log in GoToMeeting to organizers only. As of yet, we have not received any questions, but we'll keep this running. People are more than welcome to submit questions during a presentation, and we'll address them when the presenter is finished.
It's now my privilege to introduce Alan Leonardi. He's the director of NOAA, Office of Ocean Exploration and Research, and he's going to give us his perspective on NOAA's return to the Pacific. Alan?
Sure thing, Jamie. Really appreciate that. And Dan, I don't know if you guys are planning on firing up the presentation or if you're wanting me to share my screen. Either is an option, although the former is probably easier.
Yeah, we'll have Alex bring up your PowerPoint momentarily. There it is.
There we go. So welcome everybody. Thank you for being here. Apologies that it has to be in this digital electronic format rather than in person, but as Jamie indicated, we can certainly have more people participate in these types of meetings when we do it electronically. It's just that you miss out on many of the side conversations during the breaks and in the hallways before and after, and of course in the evenings as well. So that's certainly a loss, but having more people participate is certainly a gain, in my opinion. Either way, I think that the timing is really good for this, and what I'm hoping to do is to give you a little bit of the motivation for what we're hoping to get out of this, why we have sponsored COL and asked them to convene this workshop on our behalf as I go through these next few slides. So if we can jump right to the first slide, please. The first thing I want to point out is that ocean exploration truly is what I would call a new imperative. Certainly, it's been an imperative for hundreds of years, if not longer. But within this nation, it's been an imperative for the last 150 years. But it hasn't been always a strong imperative. There have been fits and starts and different activities that have focused on ocean exploration, but there's always been calls for additional reasons to conduct and convene ocean exploration. But recently, there's been a number of activities going on, particularly within the executive branch, that really signal that this is a new imperative and a high priority within the executive branch. First and foremost was the release of the executive order on critical minerals. This came out in December of 2017. Sure, it's focused on critical minerals, but a key component of this is recognizing that there are critical minerals in our ocean waters. We need to know where they are and understand what they look like and whether or not they would be harvestable. Should at some point in time somebody choose to do that. We also, of course, need to know what habitats exist in these areas to understand the impacts of harvesting such critical minerals. So that was a signal from the administration back in 2017 that this was important and that they weren't just looking at land-based sources of critical minerals anymore. As we all know, this is a pressing international conversation. In addition to this, in June of 2018, the executive order to advance ocean policy in the U.S., particularly focused on the economic, security, and environmental interests of the United States, was released. It identified any number of things of importance from an ocean exploration perspective, but also clearly to ensure access to the most advanced topographic, geologic, and geophysical data within the U.S. to improve all of those holdings, and of course to make all of it publicly accessible. Following this, in December of 2018, was the release of the Decadal Science and Technology Vision from the Office of Science and Technology Policy, which highlights as one of its near-term priorities ocean exploration and support for ocean characterization, including ongoing research and technology partnerships. This was already mentioned by Admiral Gallaudet and alluded to, at least at a minimum, by Jamie, is that in November of last year, the White House had a summit on partnerships in ocean science and technology, where one of the topics of conversation was ocean exploration. Other topics, of course, included things like unregulated fishing and aquaculture and things of that nature. But clearly, there's a focus on ocean exploration and a desire to focus on it, not just from a government perspective, but in partnership with non-government entities, whether they're academic, private, philanthropic, or otherwise. And then finally, I think the last kind of real signal over this 3-year window was the release in November of 2020 of the presidential memo on ocean mapping of the United States exclusive economic zone and the shoreline and near shore of Alaska, which called for 3 things that the Admiral talked about, which are highlighted on the next slide. First and foremost, a national strategy for mapping, exploring, and characterizing the United States exclusive economic zone. This is the part that I will focus a little bit more on here, but it also called for a strategy for mapping the coast of Alaska and recommendations for increasing the efficiency of permitting for ocean exploration, mapping, and research activities. It should be clearly noted that the administration and the executive branch has heard loud and clear from the broad community that permitting process is sometimes cumbersome, often fraught with confusion, and difficult because sometimes it requires going to multiple agencies to get a permit for the same type of work. So some sense is being made of this. We're hopefully going to make this process easier in the future. What the end state looks like at this point in time, I don't know, but implementation should take a look at that. But jumping back to the national strategy, which Jamie highlighted and talked about the goals that are addressed in there, which include fully mapping the US EEZ. Goal is by 2030 to map areas 40 meters and deeper. Hopefully by 2040, the areas 40 meters and shallower more completely. And we believe that 40 meters and deeper can be done. But we also know that it can't easily be done with current technologies. So we're going to need to ramp up what we do in the technology arena, which is why there are goals focused on that as well. We also know that we can't fully explore the United States EEZ. And to give you a sense of why this is the case, I'm going to go through a couple of slides to give you a sense of the magnitude of the challenge ahead of us. So on the next slide, I'm going to share with you the mapping gaps. These are now several months old. We've actually been able to fill some of these in a little bit, in part by finding data on hard drives sitting on desks or shelves, as well as people submitting data to the government as donations. But about 3 to 6 months ago, the state of play was this. 54% of the United States ocean, coastal, and Great Lakes waters remained unmapped at modern resolutions. And when I say unmapped at modern resolutions, we typically mean about 100-meter resolution in the shallowest zones, a little bit more coarse than that, out to 400-meter resolution in the deepest zones. Of this unmapped area, you can see in this chart 2 different color scales. Those areas that are in the lighter red color are areas deeper than 200 meters or continental shelf and outwards, and those areas in the darker red are shallower than 200 meters or continental shelf and seaward. Clearly, we have a lot of work to do on the continental shelf and seaward side. We in our office focus primarily on continental shelf and outward, but we still have a lot to do. Alaska alone is 72% unmapped. The Pacific coast is surprisingly only 24% unmapped. It's actually reasonably well mapped at the moment. The Pacific remote islands in Hawaii are 50% unmapped. So as we talk about identifying needs, priorities, desires for exploring the Pacific, we have to keep these things in mind because exploration and characterization at the end of the day starts with a map. And when the majority of the area remains unmapped to modern resolution, we have a problem. However, on the next slide, you can see that that problem starts to amplify when you think about more than just the mapping, right? So the color shaded contours on the bottom left is a piece that we believe can capably be done in the deepest water parts of the United States, even using modern technologies in about a 10-year window, with, of course, appropriate resourcing. Yet, when you start talking about habitat mapping, whether that's visualizing using AUVs and stereophotogrammetry or collecting samples with remotely operated vehicles or taking temperature and salinity and pH and dissolved oxygen profiles or even more challenging, of course, figuring out more automated ways to quickly deliver information about the metagenomic, metabolomic, other related omic information in the water column. This is a daunting problem, okay? So if 54% of the Pacific remains of the US EEZ remains unmapped, certainly about 90 to 95% remains incomplete with respect to the totality of this information. So on the next slide, you can see how the mapping piece alone is hard and it's going to be challenging, but truly exploring the marine environment is an exponential task. I think we need to be on the next slide, please. We're looking to not just collect high resolution bathymetry in areas with no or low quality data. We're also looking to identify, map, and explore the diversity and distribution of benthic habitats and the resources within them, looking at deep ocean biogeographic patterns and connectivity, some of which we know exist today, some of which we see that there are barriers to connectivity but don't understand why. We want to collect data to understand not just the benthic domain, but the pelagic domain as well. The water column is truly the least explored part of our planet, and we know very little about much of the fauna that lives there, and some of which we may not even know yet exists. And of course, at the end of the day, from an agency perspective, we want to make sure that we are acquiring data that supports priority science and management needs. We, of course, also want this to promote the advancement of science writ large, and we want this to promote the advancement of good business practices to support our economy. But the collection of all of this information in totality truly is a magnitude greater than just mapping the USEEZ. So what we're trying to do with this workshop is to identify what some of those priorities might be from an exploration perspective, so that we as an office then can determine which of those we want to address, which of those we can address through our own operations in partnership with others, which we can address through funding other people to do it, and which some of our partners might want to contribute to of their own accord and volition and funding. But ultimately, the way that we do this, or at least have started doing it within the past 5 years, is through a number of ocean exploration campaigns, which I'll describe on the next slide. Ultimately, for us, a campaign is not just an expedition, but a series of expeditions over multiple years, generally speaking, to a particular geographic area, because it's more efficient from an operations perspective, but it also could be focused on a specific theme or exploration priority of interest. Themes could include anything from deep corals and sponges to critical minerals, to methane seeps, to hydrothermal vent communities, to marine archaeological treasures that might exist, or submerged cultural landscapes. All of these things could be the subject to a campaign as from a theme and a priority perspective. We also, of course, look for complementary expeditions using a wide variety of platforms and technologies, and perhaps even different strategies. It's not just about NOAA ships and NOAA operations and the way that we do it, but the operations of others as well and the ways that they do it. Ultimately, we want to package all of that data and information. We want to share it as publicly as we can and as fast as we can to serve as a foundation for the type of information that many of our communities need, whether it's the advancement of science, whether it's for making resource management decisions, or whether it's supporting business decisions in the private sector as well. But we can't do this without robust engagement, not just in the practitioners and the people who might use this data information, but also in the public. We want them to be aware of the bounty and the beauty that exists in the oceans. We want them to appreciate it, but we also want them to understand that our lifeblood exists within the ocean, and without the oceans, we have a problem. So as part of this, partners are a clear element of what we do from a campaign perspective. It could be partnerships from an operations perspective or a science perspective. It could be partnering in technology development. It could be partnering in messaging and information and data sharing. Next slide, please. But in all of these campaign approaches, we take a nested approach to our planning of our expeditions. And that approach starts with community workshops. Top left of these 4 little quadrants, where we have a community workshop, bring together members of the community to try to identify what some of these priorities might be. We seek input through white papers. And then, of course, on the back end, we decide how we're going to use this information, what expeditions we might undertake. And then we start zeroing in more carefully on the specific locations and the specific activities and the specific data and information and the specific partners that will be participating in these expeditions, which involves consultations across the community, such as we're having today. So this is the first stage in our plan to get back to the Pacific Ocean. And on the next slide, you get a sense that we've done this before. Okay, not only have we done this from a community workshop perspective, we had a Pacific-focused workshop in December of 2014 that was co-executed with the Ocean Exploration Trust out in California. We had an Atlantic partnership workshop that took place a few years ago here in Silver Spring, Maryland, bringing together members of the community, both domestic and international, private and philanthropic and academic and government. But we've also executed these campaigns in the past. From 2015 to 2017, we really undertook our first major coordinated campaign, the Capstone campaign, which I see Jeremy Potter is on the line. He was a critical piece of when he was part of the Office of Ocean Exploration and Research. Now, he likely will be a critical piece of not just this workshop, but what happens moving forward in the Pacific with his new perch from BOEM out in California. I just share this to show you just the number of expeditions that were undertaken by the NOAA ship Okeanos Explorer, all of the different areas that we went to. The focus for this campaign was on the protected areas and the sanctuaries and the monuments within the Pacific that the U.S. has management responsibilities over, whether that's NOAA or whether that's DOI with those responsibilities. That was the focus of this effort. We explored and discovered many things in the process, and really showed how this could be done on a grand scale over multiple years using at least one vessel. Yet, on the next slide, we also know that we have existing partners that have their own assets. You see the NOAA ship, you see the Ocean Exploration Trust ship, you see the ship that's owned and operated by the Schmidt Ocean Institute, a philanthropic outfit that's really been going at it great and hard for 10 years and really advancing both exploration and science in the ocean realm. These partnerships exist today. These platforms exist today and are operational. They do things routinely on the order of hundreds of days a year, supporting the community with the community's needs. Some of it funded by NOAA, some of it not funded by NOAA or funded privately and philanthropically. Yet, on the next slide, we also have other emerging partners that potentially could play a role here. Ocean Infinity demonstrated clearly their capabilities with the MH370 search and some other recent searches that have focused more on the archaeological side of things. Vulcan has contributed significantly with respect to archaeology and will probably again in the future. What that looks like, how those operations look like, who knows? We're in conversations with them right now about what a partnership activities might look like, and I'm sure that there's something that we might be able to do. We've partnered with companies out there that are demonstrating and developing technologies, and we brought them out on our ship to give them some free time to get out there on the water and show these technologies. The top right here is Kraken Robotics technologies. OceanX has a brand new ship that's coming online. NOAA signed a memorandum of understanding with them, and we're having conversations with them about what we might be able to do together to ensure that not only they're doing great work, but that the work is benefiting the agency and humanity as a whole. And anybody who hasn't been paying attention to the deep ocean arena for the last year would not know about Victor Vescovo, but I know that you all do, and his Caladan Oceanic endeavors, becoming the first person in history to not have only summited the tallest peaks on every continent, but to have descended to the deepest depths in every major ocean basin as well. Very exciting feat and technologies, and they've been out there operating in the Pacific for weeks now and will be for the next month or two. They're collecting data on the way that they know is of interest to the agencies, and they're planning on just donating that data. No ask of the agencies other than for them to understand what's of interest. And whether they can collect it, that's entirely up to them. And then finally, of course, we've got partnerships with other companies that are looking at figuring out how to do better things with power technology. In this case, the bottom right is Open Water Power and their aluminum fuel cell technology, where we're trying to get them out on the ship, able to test these technologies capably. They're not paying for our ship time, we're giving it to them, but we're not paying them to do it either. We just get a sneak peek of the technologies and a hope that those technologies will help advance ocean science community writ large. We, of course, also wanted to help advance our own operational feats. And on the next slide, I would be remiss if I also didn't mention that NOAA has taken great pains over the last year and a half or so to develop four new science and technology strategies and some priorities. And we are now looking at putting together implementation plans for these strategies. There's one that's focused on unmanned systems. Clearly, we can't fully explore, map, and characterize the USEEZ without bringing operational unmanned systems online, whether they're surface-based or subsurface-based. Omics clearly is emergent. I personally believe that if we can find a way to more easily automate the process for collecting omics-related information, it can be a game changer for understanding ocean biodiversity, ocean health. Artificial intelligence has to be a part of this, machine learning. Clearly, if you're going to have unmanned systems out there roaming around doing missions, you want them to be smart. But you also realize that they're going to be collecting volumes of data that we have never seen before. This comes from photogrammetry, this comes from the high resolution video that's coming in, and we know that it is extremely costly to have a human in the loop on analyzing every bit of that data and information to find the most interesting parts, or even the connections between disparate locations or disparate things. So we have to bring artificial intelligence into this arena, and to whatever degree we can, it's going to help us if we can get all of this data into the cloud immediately, or as close to immediate as possible. So anybody who wants to work with that data, work on that data, can easily, without having to figure out where it is, without having to download it all to their own hard drives and store it locally and run the processing locally. So ultimately, what I want to share here in my last slide is we have a rich opportunity today from an ocean exploration perspective. There's a general consensus on the need for it. There's executive branch prioritization of it. There's bipartisan support on Congress for it. And the budgets are becoming increasingly possible. Both federal budgets and private and philanthropic budgets are increasingly possible and increasingly being directed to these ocean-related issues. But technologies are also advancing at a pace never seen before in human history, and the cost is dropping at the same time. So while capability is increasing, deploying those capabilities is becoming more economical. So that's got to be a part of our solution moving forward. And then lastly, I would be remiss if I didn't mention that the convergence of institutions, stakeholders such as those on this call and in this workshop, creates opportunities for not only understanding our joint and common needs, desires, and interests, but also for partnership and for leverage. This workshop is designed to bring these things to the fore. My hope is that by the conclusion of the series of workshops and breakout sessions and our final session in the September-ish timeframe and the final report, is that there will be rich information that not only my office can use to inform what we will do from an expedition perspective as we envision getting back to the Pacific in 2022, but perhaps what others might want to do to contribute to this effort as well. If what this produces is purely something that supports decision-making within my office, it will have been worth the time. But I believe it will be much more valuable if it will support decision-making, not just by my office, but by other organizations that conduct and support this type of work as well. So I would hope that you would all keep that in mind as you go through this workshop, the plenary today, and the breakout sessions, and come up with the final report. This is not just about NOAA's ocean exploration program. This is about a national ocean exploration program. And this is what I believe should be one of many future conversations looking at what priorities might be from a geographic context, from a thematic context, in not just the Pacific Basin, but the other parts of the USEEZ as well, if not globally. And I'll stop there, and I'm happy to take any questions if there's time and interest.
Thanks, Alan. So just want to remind everybody again that you're more than welcome to submit questions via the chat to the organizers only. And when you do so, if you could please mention who the question is directed to. We know that these questions are for Alan, but for the rest of the meeting today, if you could just mention who you're asking the question to, that would be very helpful. But with that, I'm going to pass it over to Katie, who's going to present some of the questions that we have ready for you, Alan.
Thanks, Dan. From John Admiral White, we have, what are some major hurdles to establishing the strategy's national enterprise to map, explore, and characterize the USEEZ that this workshop might help overcome?
Well, for one, anybody who's doing this work, whether you're in academia and you're doing it for the advancement of science, whether you're doing it in government to advance mission, whether you're in business to try to figure out how you can make money on it or how it can support your business, or whether you're in philanthropy, whether that's conservation oriented or whether that's information oriented, whether that's technology advancement oriented, we kind of all have different reasons we're doing this. But at the heart of it, and so that's a hurdle. I want to make that clear. Having different reasons for doing the work is a hurdle when it comes to partnering. Yet there's a commonality to those reasons, a commonality in approach. There's a commonality in practice. There's a commonality in measurement techniques. And so this workshop can help overcome some of those differences in priorities by understanding at least where the convergence may be. Those are the areas that my office really likes to look at. I could jokingly say that as we explore or support exploration, our job is to tantalize the world around us, but probably not satisfy any one individual. I say that by saying exploration is about going to a place for the first time and discovering what's there. It's not necessarily about fully characterizing that space. For whatever mission purpose you might have, whatever scientific hypothesis-driven purpose you might have, or whatever business purpose you might have. So I think one of the things that can be helped here, John, is if the workshop could help us find an understanding of where the coalescence points are and where there may be synergy across different organizations and sectors that could be ripe for partnering coming out the back end of this.
Okay, well, thanks for that, Alan. I believe Katie's prepping the next question for you. So in just a moment.
Thanks, Dan. From Donglai Gong, we have, from a technological perspective, are we prioritizing based on existing available technology or technology that the community would like to see developed in the next X number of years?
Well, some of that is to be determined by you guys in the workshop, but my approach to all of this has always been, and if we go back to one of the previous National Ocean Exploration Forums that was held at Rockefeller University that was focused on technology, I challenged the workshop participants to design an expedition of the future, assuming whatever technology you wanted to be there was there. So the key ingredient here is determine what the expedition should look like. The engineering wits that exist in this country and beyond are amazing. I believe sincerely that if you envision something that you want to collect from a data perspective, smart engineers can find out how to do it. So for me, this isn't about focusing on the technology of today and prioritizing what we can do with the technology of today, although we're going to have to do some of that from just a purely operational perspective, but also envisioning what technology needs to be brought to bear to address these things that we want to address either in the future or to address them more efficiently, right? Are there sensors that need to be integrated onto our ROVs? Are there better modes of operating these platforms? Is it really smart for us to use a ship and to get bathymetry at 100-meter scale resolution and then descend using an ROV that is a surgical strike instrument that gives you centimeter scale information? Or should we be more capably involving and integrating AUVs to get you that next layer? If we do, what should they have on them from a sensor perspective to give you just enough information to augment what you already know, if it's anything, but also to help you understand what you may need to know should you go back and what you may need to collect. So long answer made short. For me, it's not about envisioning what we can do with the technology of today. It's about envisioning what we want and are supposed to do and figuring out how to make sure the technology is there when we need it.
Thanks, Alan. We have another question from Sebastian. Comparison was made by Admiral Gallaudet in his intro on the billions spent mapping other planets. What order of magnitude budget is considered necessary to successfully meet the national mapping strategy and meet the goal of 100% of the EEZ mapped?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. Let me preface it by saying this, is that the annual budget presently for NOAA's Office of Ocean Exploration and Research, which arguably is not the only office, of course, in government supporting ocean science activities, ocean technology development, and things like that, is $42 million a year as appropriated by Congress. For perspective and context, that is about half the cost of what it takes to ferry an astronaut to the space station, but not bring them home. Okay, so 1/4 of the cost of the round trip, just to put it in perspective. But for me, I see fully exploring and mapping and characterizing our oceans as truly today's modern day moonshot, and is it a $1 billion thing? I believe doing it right is a $1 billion over 10-year enterprise. Okay, so do the math. It's probably about $100 million a year is what it takes to do this. This isn't surprising math to anybody who's been looking at the ocean exploration world over the last 2 decades, right? The presidential panel that was put together to recommend actually having an ocean exploration program within the government recommended a budget on the order of $75 million a year because they figured that that's what it would take. Inflationary costs bring that to 100. So these are not earth-shattering numbers, but doing what we want to do over the next 10 years is a $1 billion enterprise. Now, that $1 billion doesn't all have to come to my office. Others are contributing. Philanthropic organizations, the private sector, other government agencies are all contributing to this enterprise. But I believe doing this right, assuming we can frame out what we're going to do, and we have plenty of operators out there capable of delivering, is about $1 billion over 10 years.
Great, thanks, Alan. Chris Sholin asks, as we envision new technologies for meeting OE goals, how can we connect the identified research and development needs to share priorities of sponsored programs such as NOP?
Yeah, it's an excellent question, Chris. So first and foremost, as over the next 6 or so months, the National Ocean Mapping Exploration Characterization Council will be stood up and report to the Subcommittee on Ocean Science and Technology under the Ocean Policy Committee in the White House. And we will be looking to develop an implementation plan that focuses on all of the things laid out in the strategy, identifying how we're going to complete the mapping of the USEEZ, how we're going to prioritize it, how we're going to advance technologies to do that, identifying priorities for exploration, some of which could be informed by this, as well as future workshops and conversations, how we're going to develop standards and protocols that define for us what we need to do to consider a place sufficiently explored or sufficiently characterized for whatever end purpose. It's that end state purpose that's going to define the R&D needs. And I think the better we are at defining what measurements are required to meet the end state purpose, whether it's me saying an area has been sufficiently explored, whether it's BOEM saying that they have enough information to make offshore energy leasing and siting decisions, whether it's we have a full understanding of critical minerals, or whether we have full understanding of sensitive habitats, deep corals and sponges and things of that nature. It's that end state, and that end state should define the R&D that goes into the technology side of things. If the technology already exists, it's a matter of deploying it, perhaps making it more efficient and more economical. If the technology doesn't exist, then it's a matter of developing that technology, testing and evaluating the technology, and integrating it so that it can contribute capably in the future. So, probably not the most satisfying answer, and definitely not intended to kick the can down the road. But the reality is, we know sensors are getting smaller. We know they're getting more capable. We know battery life is getting better. So we can collect more and more information. The question is how do we integrate all of that in a way that makes sense? And how do we share that data information on the back end and provide tools on the back end that allow people to interrogate that data in ways that make sense as well? So not a specific answer for you, but the short answer is we're going to need to continue to advance autonomous systems. We're going to need to continue to miniaturize sensors. We're going to need to figure out how to collect more and more data and information, particularly biological data and information from the ocean, ideally in ways that don't require us always bringing a sample back to the ship or back to shore for somebody to analyze. I recognize that that's a monumental task, and there will always be need to have samples. But if we can do more of that with less back-end sample processing and curation, we're going to be better off, because we're going to be able to automate the processes. We're going to put them on ubiquitous sensing. We can add them to things like Argo floats, and all of a sudden we're getting information today that we never had before that will dramatically change how we perceive and understand the ocean.
Thanks, Alan. Chris adds, good point, good prompt for participants when discussions take place, as per Alan, define requirements that drive partnerships, research and development opportunities for industry.
Indeed, yep, no, that's a good point.
At this point, there are no other questions.
Okay, well, I appreciate everybody being here today. And when I say here in this, this digital ecosphere that we live in these days, I truly appreciate what you're going to be doing over the next couple of months. Anybody who's participated in these in the past knows some of how this works. This is a little different this time around, but also know that we are going to seriously take and consider this information to inform decisions that we make within our office in terms of our own operations and the activities that we fund. We also anticipate that this will inform where national strategy implementation goes and where implementation activities may go in the private and philanthropic sectors without any government involvement or in partnership. So appreciate your time and attention. I really look forward to the upcoming conversations and ultimately the report, so we can use that to help us make decisions.
Thanks, Alan. I'm going to toss one more at you from Donglei. What role does workforce training and development factor into near-term ocean exploration priorities?
Excellent question, Dawn. Anybody who knows anything about the Office of Ocean Exploration and Research knows that one of the pillars of what we do is public engagement and education. We work with communities to develop lesson plans. We provide teacher professional development training, at least in non-COVID times, and then those teachers use those lesson plans in schools. We also support internship programs on our ship and in our facilities. And for me, none of this is going to be successful if we're not paying attention to workforce development. If we're not exciting the children of today to go into STEM-related fields, whether it's oceanography or engineering or even communications, we have to excite them today. But it's not sufficient to excite the elementary schools and the middle schoolers. We have to keep them excited about it and get them matriculating into degree programs and then matriculating into careers that are going to support this. The endeavor we're talking about is not a 2-3 year thing. While this effort may dramatically inform the next 2 to 3 years, fully mapping, exploring, and characterizing the USEZ is a multi-decade effort. And as you look at the screen, some of us will not be involved in that effort in 2 decades' time. New faces will emerge, and we need those new faces to be matriculating into these fields and getting the training that they need. We also need those faces to be representative of our population. We need better diversity. And that's not just women versus men. That's not African American versus white or Hispanic. It's also diversity of background, diversity of experience, and diversity of education. Some of the greatest ideas of our time that have been technological were not conceived by engineers and scientists. The idea was conceived by somebody who saw a need, and they worked with an engineer and scientist to develop the solution. So we need to make sure that we're including people in our workforce goals that may not have come up through the traditional ranks the way that we would normally rank them and conceive of them and choose them for positions within the organization. So Don, I hope that that's helpful. I think it's certainly consistent with the goals from the STEM plan and strategy that came out of the White House a year and a half ago, and is consistent with national interests and priorities as well. So we want to be a part of that. To the degree that we can help lead it, we will.
Okay, well, that was great. Thank you, Alan. And your slides impressed so many people. We had a lot of questions about getting copies of your PowerPoint slides available for the participants. Just want to let everybody know that we will make all the slides that are presented at the meeting today available next week, so you can look forward to that. Since there are no other questions at this time, we'll go ahead and start our 15-minute break a little bit early. So let's go ahead and adjourn now and come back at 2:20 p.m. Eastern, and we'll start the breakout leader presentations. Thank you, everybody. All right, so we've got the slides up for everyone to see. It looks like Jim is ready to go. So welcome back, everyone. So for this second part of the meeting today, we're going to be hearing from each of the breakout teams who will provide a description of their subject matter and their overall plan for the breakout session discussions, which will be occurring over the course of the next month or so. So to kick us off, we're going to start with Dr. Jim Delgado from Search Inc., talking about the cultural heritage breakout material. And go ahead, Jim.
Thank you, and hello, everybody. It's good to see everybody, even via virtual means, and to co-present this with Ambassador Hume. Cameron's asked that I start on this, and we will both be working on that breakout session. And I'm also glad to see that some who will be in the breakout session are also with us here today. We can probably go to the next slide. One of the most exciting things about this, and it's something that is reflected in the white papers, both from the past and where we are heading with the white papers for this session, is the fact that this is the Pacific Ocean. And that's not to say that the other oceans aren't important, but in terms of the Pacific, not only is it big in size, it's big in human history. And one of the things that we clearly will be looking at in the breakout session is that while underwater cultural heritage perhaps has been viewed in the past as either man-made debris or shipwrecks, it's a far bigger field, particularly in regard to the types of resources. The other thing that we would also want to be stressing in this breakout session is that throughout this, you're going to be hearing us address not only underwater cultural heritage, but cultural heritage, because one of the clearest messages that will be permeating that discussion, but I would like to suggest goes to the heart of what all of these discussions are, is that the Pacific is more than just the sum total of nation states with economic interests bordering the Pacific Rim on both sides of the ocean as well as down south. The Pacific is an area with a large and vast indigenous population with cultures that are closely interconnected and intertwined with the sea. And we are looking at a body of water which historically was populated by their ancestors in some of the greatest human voyages ever of settlement, exploration, colonization, and interconnectivity. And so we don't want to be losing track of that, but in that also understanding that we will need to engage with those communities. And while we can think of Native Hawaiians, for example, other cultures as well are very, very important to be involved in this discussion. And to that end, one of the things you'll also see, next slide please, is that there are cultures that exist in all of our countries, and in the United States in particular, who are indigenous communities who do relate to these waters and understand, and we'll come back to this in a bit, that a fair amount of their cultural heritage is now submerged beneath the sea. They relied on the sea as the means by which they would come to the Americas and settle. They relied on the sea as a great source of sustenance, and it is powerfully and culturally intertwined. And so to that end, again, that engagement as we do these surveys, and as some of us know from our work, particularly off the coast of California or up in Alaska, does involve not only consultation, but active engagement and working with these cultures as well. Next slide. So much of the history of the Pacific, of course, also relates to great voyages of exploration and discovery as the Pacific was incorporated into the larger global economic system beginning in the 18th century. And while we know of explorers and their various voyages, one thing that will be ever present is, one, in engaging the indigenous communities, is making sure that their sensitivity, that engagement does not over glorify or look solely at, hey, we've got to find this shipwreck or that shipwreck pertaining to a specific explorer, but also understand the nuances of cultural connection. The Europeans and ultimately the rest of us changed the Pacific. And again, as we embrace this and as we look at this, it's going to be critical that we address that. Next slide. This map is from 1914, and what it shows are all the major shipping routes in the Pacific at that time. This is a reminder that as we do this surveying and mapping, we're going to be passing over areas that were actively used, and this in no way deals with the nuances of intercoastal trade or interconnections between various nations, the Pacific was an active highway. And as an active highway, obviously, there's going to be a fair amount of underwater cultural heritage that's going to be sitting down there. That being said, we know from other expeditions and mapping that sometimes you can mow the lawn for big areas of seabed and not see much that speaks to a human presence. I recall one survey that found a handful of 50-gallon drums, and that was about it. But having said that, I think what we're also going to be seeing is that we will be encountering some of these remains, and not just shipwrecks, as mapping continues. One thing to remember is that, of course, in the deeper waters, we might very well see areas where, as Dr. Ballard's team found with Skirky Bank, you have areas that are just a bad patch on the highway where things will go down. The other point, of course, is that by necessity, as we survey closer in and around a number of great ports, we're going to see larger numbers accumulated and in those areas. Most recently, some of the NOAA surveys off the Farallones and the Greater Farallones National Marine Sanctuary areas showed a large number of ships, and we find that in and around every port. Basically, in the cultural heritage field, what we like to refer to, I like to call this the Whole Foods parking lot theory of shipwreck distribution. And it comes down to the fact that the largest number of accidents, particularly when I lived in Silver Spring, all seem to happen when people are trying to get in and out of the Whole Foods parking lot, or in the parking lot as they jockeyed for a spot. And that funny little adage is a reminder that, of course, in the ocean world, as you're lining up to go in and out of a port, say the narrow gap of the Golden Gate, or into Sydney, or into Yokohama, or into a number of these places, shipwrecks tend to happen more often. The other point with this, and we'll go to the next slide, is that while we, of course, are talking about shipwrecks, the largest number in the potential population do come from the 20th century, and in particular from World War II. There are thousands of them that will be out there, and they will dominate in some ways the record. And while so much work has been done to locate some of these vessels, particularly given their iconic importance and their meaning to families, and the fact that they're more readily able to be found given the current technology, they, in and by themselves, while they may dominate the record, should not necessarily dominate priorities. And this will be something that we'll be talking about. Finding iconic battleships, and yeah, we've all sort of done that and seen it, is one part of the puzzle, but there's more to it. In particular, one of the things that we will be grappling with in the breakout session, and I want to throw it out there for the rest of you, is that the 100-meter level is fine for finding the big stuff, but it won't find the small stuff. And so for the kind of characterization that we would like to be doing as cultural folks, we need to go closer and we need to go lower in the water to do that. And we understand and appreciate that's not going to be the case everywhere. One of the things that we'll be doing in the breakout session is trying to define priority areas, where in particular, closer survey might yield some fascinating results. Next slide. Clearly in shallow waters, we find a whole range of shipwrecks, some of which are more readily seen and visible. That is a reminder, coming back to the earlier points, that there's going to be clusters of these things. One point of interest, of course, when Alan was talking, is that the northern Hawaiian Islands in the area of Papahanaumokuakea National Marine Monument, it's only 50% surveyed. I think we would find more of these sorts of things out there. The deep water stuff is going to largely be World War II. Next slide. Clearly, we've seen some tremendous discoveries, and I think a big shout out in particular, is there for our colleagues at Vulcan, Rob Kraft and the team. The work they've done has absolutely been magnificent, and we've seen discoveries of ships that have greatly excited the public, and we'll come back to that point in just a second. Next slide. I think clearly when you find a ship like Indianapolis, that resonated with the public in a very powerful way, as well as a variety of other specific communities, and particularly with survivor families. Next slide. And most recently, working with Ocean Infinity, our own team found USS Nevada. And with that, we were surprised again, and perhaps not so surprised, that these discoveries, as you know, Bob and so many of the others of you know so well, do generate media, but they also generate actual caring by people. This is a ship that served with distinction, that suffered a great deal, was seen to be too tough to die, and ultimately was sunk in a sustained barrage, as well as by aerial torpedoes in 1948. Its location was generally known. With Ocean Infinity, with their Hugin AUVs, we were able to locate this pretty quickly and map it at a shallower, actually we came closer than 100 meters, to a very high level of accuracy and visit it. And while we didn't do it as a live telepresence mission, just the same, people have responded powerfully to that discovery as they responded to the Vulcan discoveries, as they respond to the OET discoveries, as they respond to the NOAA discoveries and the discoveries made by other colleagues. Next slide. And we see that even when we're close to home, one of the NOAA missions where we were looking at something that had powerful messages about World War II, but also had some sensitivities in Gulf of the Farallones National Marine Sanctuary was USS Independence, a mission that we started at with NOAA through, working with OER, and then ultimately with Ocean Exploration Trust and Dr. Ballard's team. And in that, we were able to engage an audience, but also address some areas of concern, particularly around the fact that this ship had been subjected to atomic bomb testing and had been sunk with quote unquote nuclear waste. Next slide. When I bring up this question of nuclear waste, by the way, we're going to come back to that in just a second, but one of the things that we will be addressing with cultural heritage is that not all cultural heritage is necessarily a nice thing or a good thing, and that will be something to be talked about. But I also want to point out this mission, which was a NOAA OER mission, and with Okeanos, and this was taking a look at an aircraft. This is a B-29 off of Saipan, actually right off of Tinian, and it was a rather powerful and interesting mission. It was a live telepresence one, but it took a look at aircraft from World War II, particularly associated with the end of the war. And it highlighted not only that connection with wartime wrecks and with families, but it also reminds us that underwater cultural heritage includes aircraft. And aircraft are important. The white papers do address this, but there are other areas where I think aircraft are going to be of significance. When Alan talked about mapping the Northwestern Hawaiian Islands, and knowing the tremendous work that Rob and team did with Vulcan, one of the areas that I think we should probably be pursuing at some stage is mowing the lawn in between where Bob found the Yorktown and where Rob and team found Kaganakagi, because in that area are going to be the aircraft from those heroic young men who flew those sorties that brought an American victory at Yorktown. Hundreds of aircraft sitting on the seabed, and if the same conditions are there as we saw with Rob's and Vulcan's work with the Lexington at the Coral Sea, those aircraft will be identifiable. And so that aspect of underwater cultural heritage will be important. And in that, dare I say, that type of an approach will be of interest to others in the government, particularly DPAA, whose job it is to try to find the remains of Americans who were lost and never came home in combat. Next slide. Again, as we've seen with so many of these missions, they grab attention. And we realize that as the cultural heritage folks. And in that, we understand quite humbly that while we can provide some of that sizzle, we're also there to interact and work with the rest of you. And that so much of what we do, as you will see in some of the other breakout sessions, will involve using some of these shipwrecks as timestamps to look at colonization, as well as the impacts that they pose on this in the ocean environment. But finally, and to that point, particularly with telepresence-enabled missions of characterization that follow mapping, they're one means by which we can continue to sell the point that this heritage ties us to the seas, and it connects people in the heartland who might think that they're distant from the oceans to some of the powerful stories that are represented by these ships. Next slide, please. We certainly saw that with the Okeanos Explorer mission to the Japanese midget sub at Pearl Harbor for the 75th anniversary. And with that, as we reached millions of people, the one thing that was also clear is that at times, coming back to some of the earlier discussions or the earlier points I made in this presentation, there are sensitive subjects, but there are also opportunities to come together and to heal old wounds. That dive started with a prayer in Japanese for the two dead men inside, and ended with the note that 75 years on, the sons of both countries slept in steel coffins rusting in the sea, and that perhaps that was an incentive for us to be looking beyond, finding opportunities to contest and to fight with each other or go to war. Next slide. To that end, though, a couple of other points. Some underwater cultural heritage may be more recent, and while we find it, we may not want to let everybody know where it is. I know that Navy ships sunk in SINKEXs are going to be out there. Bob, remember finding the Peterson? I mean, so to that end, when we find these things and we are mapping and characterizing, we're not going to necessarily want to put everything on the chart, but we will want to know that it's there. Next slide. And that also becomes true as we will see, and again, just off of my own home coast of California, there are dumps that are there that are marked and delineated on the charts, and we're going to want to be able to map and characterize that in particular, but we're also not going to want to be very specific in terms of what is down there or where exactly you can come to get it. Next slide. Finally, looking at where we're going with all of this, the point comes back to a couple of things, and that moving beyond more recent and bigger, more identifiable ships. Looking at the coast of Alaska, both mapped shallow as well as deeper, that is Beringia, and that is the highway by which people crossed into America to settle it at the end of the last ice age. That landscape will be full of archaeological evidence of those people and of the colonization of the Americas. And that poses a very exciting opportunity in terms of rewriting the story of people coming to the continent. And it's of great interest to a number of partners, and it speaks powerfully to the larger human story. We're certainly going to be seeing anywhere we go in the shallower, 100-meter and less environment, evidence of this, and existing research is now taking place. But Beringia in particular is an opportunity that should not be passed up, and that's why it's a white paper, and it's something that we will be talking about. Next slide. Coming down to it, there are going to be other wrecks, and sometimes these wrecks that we've seen through discoveries that have been made have been accidental. I point these out because some of these are going to be older wrecks. They're going to be wrecks that might not be so visible and wouldn't show up at the 100-meter range, but again, might be very significant and important. These would include not only ships of exploration, but vessels engaged in early trade and commerce, as well as potentially at some level, the opportunity to find the remains on the seabed of ancient Polynesian voyages where canoes broke apart or tumbled to the bottom, or just their contents went down there. Clearly, we can't be mapping right up close to the seabed to find every ancient shipwreck. But one of the things that might be looked at, and we'll talk about in the breakout session, is certain priority areas or ways in which it could be done. But also to that end, just a reminder to you all, following OET's and NOAA's model of doctors on call, even if we're not there, pick up the phone and call us, have us dial in. Remembering that not too long ago, NOAA was just testing systems and came across a shipwreck in the Gulf of Mexico, and we all were able to pile on and offer some thoughts about it. We're there. We'd like to be integrated into these missions, whether it's there at the start or at least to be called, and that's one of the reasons why I like working, particularly with Bob and OET, is they've got the archaeologists on speed dial. And with that, the archaeologists have learned that they're there, but it's not all about them. So with that, next slide. These are just a few of the take-home points. I don't need to read them all. I think we've made a number of these points, but I do want to emphasize one thing that Ambassador Hume said at the start, and that is that all exploration is human exploration and all discovery is human discovery. And what can our discoveries tell us about humans? It comes back to where cultural heritage fits in. We're more than media front page grabbers. We speak to the heart of the human experience and how it relates to the oceans. And fundamentally, what we are talking about with this new strategy is not only an economic strategy, but it's reminding Americans, and by extension our other neighbors, of the importance of the oceans. It's there, it's powerful, it's pervasive, and embracing human stories as part of this works better than anthropomorphizing marine creatures. It reminds people as a self-interested species that the oceans mean something to them, whether it's a family story, whether it's an ancient human story, whether it's a myth made real, or it's the excitement of real people. All of you in the audience and everybody else out there who joins us to telepresence to engage in the final frontier. Thank you.
Thanks, Jim. That was great. Yeah, very interesting. We have one question for you, and I'll let Katie ask that.
Thanks, Dan, and thanks, Jim. John White asks, has there been much international engagement by NOAA, State Department, etc. to date on the Heritage OE mission? It seems to be a U.S. area of high interest, but what about others?
It's a good question, and there has been engagement. When I was at NOAA, we worked pretty closely with Japan. We also had international agreements in place with Spain, as well as France, that are still there, for example, in terms of not only data sharing, but also coordinating with some of this. And I see the opportunities as well where we could be doing that moving forward. And I think it's going to be key, in particular for areas such as Midway or others. But yeah, no, it's been actively there, and maybe Cameron might want to chime in a bit as an ambassador.
Yeah, I think obviously working with others is critical in this area. I'd just like to pick up on one thing that Jim started out with that I think is really important, and that is that because often exploration is going to be designed for some other particular goal. I think it's important that our group be able to identify the type of kit and the type of background, the type of technology and the type of team that's needed in order to be able to look for things while a mission is doing perhaps other things or be on call, as Jim had pointed out. And I would, obviously there are some areas where we know we're going to have targets, but most of the areas I think we're not going to know. And so they would be good. It's good to have a generalized approach as well as a sense of specific targets. Thank you.
Thanks, Cameron. Thanks, Jim. We have one more question from Lisa Levin. What are the opportunities for bringing traditional knowledge and cultural heritage as it relates to the deep ocean into ocean exploration activities? The Pacific Island nations have a strong link to the high seas via navigation, rights of nature, animal migrations, etc.
I think it's absolutely critical. NOAA has done a good job of that, particularly in the Office of National Marine Sanctuaries, with the interactions, not only with Hawaii humpback whale, but with Papahanaumokuakea. More can be done. I know that our colleagues in New Zealand have been looking at that with the Maori, and likely there would be other engagement with Polynesian communities, particularly moving down into the South Pacific. But for us in the US, we'd be remiss if we didn't also deal with the Chamorro population and some of the other folks. But in terms of traditional knowledge, it would be people like Nainoa Thompson and others who are going to say, this is the way we came. These are the currents that were followed. These are the routes that were mapped. And they'll be very different in terms of where we might be looking as a priority area to see if the conditions were such that over time, with the thousands of years of ocean voyaging in those canoes, where canoe upsets or things might have happened, where we could say as a test mission, let's drop down and survey really close to see if we can pick up a poi pounder or two on the seabed. And again, that's going to be a very different route than one is going to be taking if they're sailing or if they're punching through to make a fast trip on a steamer. Absolutely critical point, And I think that we've got some groundwork that's already been put down there by NOAA.
Great. Well, thank you, Jim. Thank you, Cameron. And thank you to John and Lisa for those great questions. At this time, we're going to move on to our next presentation on seafloor characterization by David Miller from Fugro. And the floor is yours, David.
Okay, thanks, Dan. So I was asked to just start with just a brief introduction for myself and my co-lead, Dr. Larry Mayer. So as Dan mentioned, I'm David Miller and I'm the Government Accounts Director for Fugro in the Americas region. I'm based in the DC area, and I'm the Key Account Manager for the United States government as well as other national governments within the Americas region. I'm responsible for also the United Nations, the World Bank, and other multilateral development banks, and responsible for the development and execution of our partnerships with public sector clients, as well as our collaborative science initiatives and activities. I lead Fugro's global support and participation in seabed 2030 and the United Nations Decade of Ocean Science for Sustainable Development. And I'm a member of the JEPCO Guiding Committee, a member of the IHO Crowdsourced Bathymetry Working Group, and on the seabed 2030 establishment team. I've worked more than 30 years of ocean mapping, marine geophysical, and hydrographic survey experience. But I'm an engineer by education and got my engineering degree at the University of New Brunswick in Canada, where I first met my co-lead, Dr. Larry Mayer. So many of you know Larry, but I'll highlight some of his highlights and experiences, which are very relevant, obviously, to this group. Larry is a professor and founding director of the Center of Coastal and Ocean Mapping at the University of New Hampshire, and he has led. So he has a PhD in marine geophysics from Scripps and did his postdoc at the School of Oceanography at the University of Rhode Island. Larry is currently the chair of the National Academies of Sciences Ocean Studies Board, a member of the State Department's Extended Continental Shelf Task Force, the Navy's SciSex Advisory Committee, and vice chair of the board of the Ocean Exploration Trust. In 2016, Larry was appointed by President Obama to the Arctic Research Commission. In 2017, he was elected to the Hydrographic Society Hall of Fame. In 2018, he was elected to the National Academy of Engineering. And in 2019, he was elected as a foreign member of the Royal Swedish Academy of Sciences. In 2020, Larry became the first recipient of the Walter Munk Medal from the Oceanography Society. Larry's current research deals with sonar imaging and remote characterization of the seafloor, as well as advanced applications of 3D visualization of ocean mapping problems and applications of mapping to the law of sea issues, particularly in the Arctic. And Larry has participated in more than 95 cruises during his career. So it's my great pleasure to collaborate and work with Larry on the seafloor characterization breakout session. And on this slide, you'll see kind of how that will be structured and some boundaries that we have created in the scope. So if you look at the various breakout sessions, seafloor characterization actually can be involved in several of these, including marine resources and biological characterization and even cultural heritage. So what we have tried to establish here within the seafloor characterization breakout session is to focus on the core systems and solutions and methods and technologies that are common to all of these applications, and focus on kind of the scale and various scales and resolutions that will be relevant for seafloor characterization, and not focusing as much on the specific tools and techniques and sensors that may be required for other more specific applications. So starting here on the left with large scale mapping, this is really dealing with mapping at a resolution that would be several meters to tens of meters, up to 100 meters, potentially depending on water depth. and primarily focusing on surface acquisition, so ship or surface vessel sensors. And various data types that will be acquired through this approach. And of course, the first is bathymetry. This will allow us to extract morphology, which can include seamounts, canyons, abyssal plains, shelves, slope measurements, ridges, depressions, tectonic processes, and so on. It will allow us to extract and look at roughness and rugosity, also dynamics and hazards, including sand waves, erosion, mass movements, and so on. And then depending on the scale, and if the sites are large enough, also relevant to cultural heritage sites. So the next major data type is seafloor backscatter, which will allow us to identify substrate type, such as sand, silt, clay, gravel, cobble boulders, seafloor massive sulfides, nodules, and so on. Then lastly, water column backscatter from the multi-beam or from fisheries echo sounders. And while not directly associated with seafloor characterization, these are essentially byproducts of that process. But with this information, we can identify gas seeps, either natural or man-made, biological targets, as well as oceanography. Moving next to then medium scale, and you'll see that the same data types apply, but the scale is different. And that comes back to a point made earlier by Jim, and that's getting sensors closer to the seafloor. So for medium scale mapping, we envision an AUV operating several meters or tens of meters above the seafloor, providing bathymetry data, seafloor backscatter information, water column information. That ultimately at that altitude, centimeter scale, 3D imagery, and morphology. So it allows us to provide obviously a much higher degree of resolution and scale in our characterization process. Then moving on to even a finer scale would be sensors operating on a remotely operated vehicle. And this remotely operated vehicle would be typically right at the seafloor. And again, capable of collecting all of these data types that I've described already. But at this point, with the vehicle being essentially on the seafloor, we're able to extract millimeter scale 3D imagery and morphology information. So you can see the various levels of scale, and all will apply to these discussions that we will have. Then there's also the sampling, and sampling can be used in any of these scales of mapping. The generic sampling methods we have included here, grab sampling, coring, and drilling. But we have not included by design here specific geochemical or biological sensors like underway mass spectrometers, eDNA, sniffers, or other things. And those types of sensors and sampling will be addressed in the other breakout sessions that are more focused on specific applications. Okay, next slide, please, Dan. So this is the way that we have decided to break up our breakout session. And as you probably know, at least those that are in our breakout session for seafloor characterization, our session will span 2 days with 2 hours per day. So in the first day, in the first hour, we're going to focus on data and capabilities. We're going to ask what are the data requirements that define seafloor characterization at the appropriate scale. What existing capabilities, be they technologies, platforms, etc., are available to collect the needed data, and what new data are required for seafloor characterization, and are there any gaps in the existing data? And then lastly, what new capabilities, again, where relative to technologies or platforms, would further enable the collection of the needed data. In the second hour on the first day, we were going to be discussing partnerships, and we will be looking at existing partnerships and new partnerships that could further create more effective seafloor characterization in the Pacific. On the second day, we will focus the first hour on blue economy. So what is the relevance and importance of seafloor characterization to a sustainable blue economy? And then in the second hour, put this all in the context of the national program. How might our prior 3 hours regarding capabilities, partnerships, and relevance to the blue economy inform the implementation of the broader national ocean exploration program? And what aspects of the national program would be most beneficial compared to separate regional managed programs? And then to identify the regional needs and the geographic priorities, largely as defined or evidenced through the white papers, which were being provided through for pre-reading material. So this, over the 2 days, we hope to cover all of these subjects, and Larry and I look forward to working with our group to address all of these issues. Larry, is there anything else that you would like to add at this point?
We're getting a thumbs up from Larry.
Okay.
So I assume he thinks that you were very thorough. Unless, Larry, do you want to jump in?
No, I think Dave presented a very nice overview of what we hope to cover. It's a hugely broad subject. I think part of the key is going to be constraining what we talk about. And I think that's why so much effort was put into this concept of boundary conditions, what we really want to talk about. And then after that, and this goes back to Delgado's point of trying to take a look at the appropriate scale at which we look at things and how we sequence what the hierarchy of scales will be to try to go from the broadest scale mapping down to this concept of characterization.
Great. Thank you, Larry. So I believe we do have a few questions queued for David and Larry. So I'll pass it to Katie to present those to you.
Thanks, Dan, and thanks, David. From Beth, for the sampling scope, do you envision that in situ sensors would also be part of the scope in addition to traditional sampling?
Yeah, so I think that's probably going to be more addressed by the other applications. So the biology characterization, the resources characterization. Again, it's part of the boundary conditions that we created. We tried to keep things relatively simple and generic in the sense that they cover all of these things. And I think some of the in situ measurements will be more application focused and driven, and we've kind of allowed that to sit in the other sessions.
Great, thanks, David. Vicky Freeney asks, what about imaging the sub-seafloor as a part of characterizing the seafloor?
Okay, yeah, Vicky, that is a good question. It has not been brought up or discussed as part of the scope that we have put together so far. So as far as I know, I don't believe we are planning to go beyond the superficial conditions and are beyond maybe grab sampling and some coring, but I don't believe we're looking at necessarily significant, I guess sub-bottom. There could be sub-bottom involved in some cases as well. So maybe that is part of the discussion.
Great, thanks. One more, Jenny Waddle asks, earlier in the plenary, speakers mentioned that seafloor greater than 40 meters was the priority. However, there are some areas of the near shore, jump back here, that are very high priority. Will progress be made in nearshore areas in the near term as well?
Okay, I see that Alan has answered Jenny's question, so I will defer the answer to that provided by Alan.
Perfect, thanks.
Yeah, and David, if I may, this is Alan.
Yeah, please.
I want to make clear that in development of the national strategy, the reason the focus on 40 meters and deeper was made as a nearer term priority is because we expect that things like autonomous vehicles are going to be coming online and be made operational in the next 5 to 10 years. That will make doing 40 meters and shallower much more economically feasible than it is today. It doesn't mean that work shallower than 40 meters today is not going to get done. Certainly there are priority areas, but that we expect that doing it all is going to be done more effectively and efficiently in the future when we operationalize autonomous systems. Either way, for the Office of Ocean Exploration Research, sponsor of this workshop, looking to use this information to inform our decisions, our focus has always been continental shelf and deeper, roughly 200 meters and deeper, with the exception of marine cultural heritage, where shallower makes a lot of sense.
And let me chime in for a second too, and Alan's absolutely right that certainly autonomous vehicle technology will improve and will help address the shallowest of the shallow. But when we talk about 40 meters or deeper, we're actually in a region where remote sensing, both LiDAR and satellite imagery, can really make a contribution to mapping and characterization. And so in areas where the water allows lake penetration, we really have opportunities there.
Thank you, Alan, and thank you, Larry, and thank you, David, for that great presentation and overview of the seafloor characterization breakout session. So just a reminder for those of you who might have joined us a little late, you are able to submit questions via the GoToMeeting chat. Just please make sure to submit those to organizers only, and we'll pass those on to the presenters for you. So with that, we're going to move on to our next breakout session topic. That's going to be biology characterization, presented by Dr. Amanda Demopoulos from the USGS. And Amanda, you can take it away.
Thanks so much. Can you all hear me okay? I just want to start with that.
Loud and clear.
Great, fantastic. Well, Daniel Wagner and I are co-convening this breakout group on biological characterization, and we want to thank you all for volunteering your time and gray matter to this discussion on identifying priorities for the Pacific Ocean. Can we go on to the next slide, please? With regards to the US Pacific region specifically, it is a vast area, very remote and logistically challenging to access, as you all well know. It's bigger and deeper and more prone to bad weather than other US regions, in fact. And as a result, we need to be really strategic about identifying priority targets for exploration, as well as be very flexible and nimble in our operations. In terms of areas of interest, as you can see on the left-hand side of the screen, there's a diverse array of environments that are represented within the Pacific Ocean that remain to be explored, that are interesting in terms of the biology and ecology. And these environments were basically well represented within the white paper submissions. You can see in the right-hand side, the green dots represent the white papers that were submitted for this call. The brown/orangey areas, polygons, represent areas that were proposed in the previous workshop that was mentioned earlier on in this talk in 2014. And there's a lot of coalescence across those areas in terms of areas that need to be explored in terms of the biological environments. And as also you can see that much of it remains within the US EEZ, but clearly there are some areas outside. The workshop ideas, the white papers, span the full latitudinal range from the Aleutians in the Arctic to all the way to the Pacific Antarctic rise. And based on this compilation, there's a number of areas that remain to be explored and also represent cross-cutting topics that include all of the areas focused here in today's presentations and future working groups. So while the focus of this and previous workshops has been on the exploration of US Pacific waters, we're surveying in areas that require passage through international waters and therefore require international cooperation. We also have the opportunity to explore these international areas and answer questions that have more broad applicability. But like I said, it will require international partnerships, and I'll discuss that a bit more in a little later. So if we move on to the next slide. The regions in the Pacific that have been proposed in interest for this for the white papers for this workshop also overlay some proposed major biogeographic provinces. This is the color coding that's represented in the Watling et al. Paper from 2013 in the bathyal zone in particular. And these areas been proposed as boundaries that represent patterns that are driven by deep ocean currents, mostly north-south water masses, and upper bathyal currents across the equator. And this is also reflected in steep boundaries in the abyssal zone on the next slide. And examining and characterizing the ecology and biology within these areas will help us better identify connections across these boundaries. And I want to paraphrase something that Chris German brought up in his white paper, that we need to understand the diversity of life in the Pacific Ocean, the largest refuge for marine life on Earth, and it remains largely unexplored. So in the next slide, what do we mean by defining characterization of the biology? Well, that's something that the working group is going to have to talk about. What do we mean by biological characterization in the context of deep sea exploration? I think we need to talk about what are the important research and management questions, and then identify the specific variables that we have that are most critical to answer those questions. Some of those may be a combination of, but not limited to, mapping, quantifying abundance and diversity, identifying connectivity, and collecting vouchers to verify images of fauna, characterizing the seafloor carbonate chemistry to better understand the distribution of corals, among many other questions and key variables. But given the limited time and scope, we chose not to focus on resurveying of locations that have been well studied, identifying the minimum observation or sample sizes that are needed to properly characterize a specific site. We won't be focusing on organisms that are pelagic or live in the water column. That's a topic for another breakout group. And we won't be focusing on sampling techniques that have major impacts on the biota or on the environment. So in the next slide, how do we really do characterization? Now, I basically populated this slide with some favorite technologies that we've all been using through various efforts to explore the seafloor. And recent exploration efforts like Capstone and Nautilus and the Flow Corps have focused efforts on seafloor mapping and visual surveys using ROVs in particular. There's a number of deep sea exploration technologies available, some of which are illustrated here. And we ultimately, as I mentioned at the beginning, that we need to think strategically of how we utilize existing assets as well as build on and utilize new technologies to advance our understanding of the region. Not only utilizing new technology, but also build on the vast amount of data that's been collected. We do need to tap into technologies that work in extreme environments, given this huge range of environments that plan to be explored. Mapping and imaging those seafloor environments and collecting discrete samples is critical, as well as utilizing telepresence and artificial intelligence and machine learning to advance image processing capabilities. Advancing technologies that can help us gather data, such as using autonomous surface vehicles to babysit autonomous underwater vehicles to help promote efficient at-sea operations. And this all is captured in the 4 NOAA strategies that Alan and Tim mentioned at the beginning of this talk, the artificial intelligence, the cloud computing, the genomics, and the unoccupied systems. But those are some of the technologies that we need to bring to bear in order to fully explore these areas. Last but not least, on the last slide, I want to talk about the partnerships that we need to bring to bear. And this slide is intentionally slightly boring. It's a blank slate in many ways, intentionally because while this region is very vast and logistically challenging, we need to require multiple partners from various backgrounds to plan and execute the work in the region, as well as disseminate the results to the wide variety of audiences. We need to think beyond the organizations that have traditionally been involved in this type of work, such as federal and state agencies and academic institutions, but how we can engage other groups to help make important contributions. And this ultimately will require breaking down some existing silos of partnerships to foster and engage new ones. This can include philanthropic organizations and community-based organizations, NGOs, and private sector. Ultimately, since this work will require us moving through international waters in particular, we have the opportunity to engage with agencies from other governments and intergovernmental organizations to make meaningful global contributions. And there are many global policies that are being developed as we speak, including the UN Decade for Ocean Science, the Convention for Biological Diversity, deep sea mineral regulations, as well as others. So we have an opportunity here to meaningfully inform these policies, as well as develop international partnerships that are required to execute this work. I want to finish with this slide saying that most importantly, successful ocean exploration program in the Pacific hinges on us proactively improving equity, access, and inclusion. And at the very least, this will engage diverse voices that will enable a sense of ownership in exploration and characterization, which can lead to innovation as well as improved outcomes. For this breakout group, I know several of us have success stories that we can bring to our discussions regarding how we engage local communities and scientists and stakeholders in our science and the positive results that were associated. And I want to hear those stories. Daniel and I are keen to hear the stories, the successes, and build on those lessons learned. Particularly, it is critical with working in the Pacific region. Our breakout group has the benefit of meeting last, so we have the opportunity to build on those previous discussions, identify where there are cross-discipline and group linkages and synergies, and expand on partnerships previously discussed. And because of our limited time to discuss all of these complex areas during our biological sessions, we want to ask our group to start thinking about your success stories and capture those thoughts. Lastly, we will reach out to you prior to our session with a short survey to help initiate and jumpstart those thoughts. And I'm really excited to work with you all in this biological characterization group. Appreciate you volunteering your time, which I know is always short. So thanks so much.
Well done, Amanda. Thank you. And you were very thorough in your presentation. And at this point, we don't have any questions for you in the chat. I'm sure that the participants will think of questions in the following days. So just as a reminder, if we don't answer your question today or you think of more questions later, again, you can email your breakout session leader or the moderator, Jamie Austin, or any of the CLL staff, and we'll all be happy to answer your questions.
And, I will follow up with one thing to say that a number of us leads will be sitting in on the other working group discussions or breakout group discussions so that we can help efficiently pull together the final report and also help identify where discussions and synergies are important for us to have in the biological characterization. So there will be that connectivity and communication.
Absolutely. Thanks, Amanda. And actually, it does look like we had a question come in, so I'll pass it to Katie at this time.
Thanks, Dan, and thanks, Amanda. Dongley asks, seafloor biology is presumably coupled with pelagic physical and biological processes. Should we invest in gaining better understanding of that coupling on different scales of explorations?
I think it is key for us to understand the distribution of biological communities on the seafloor, for us to understand the food that's supplying them. And key to that is what's raining down from the water column in many of the places in the deep sea. So in ways that we can explore that through this effort or through tying into partnerships that can better investigate and do in situ sampling to characterize what's happening in that benthic pelagic coupling realm, I think will be critical for us to better model where we see these seafloor communities in other parts of the globe that we can explore.
It looks like we had one more question come in, so we'll address that and then we'll move on to the next presentation. Go ahead, Katie.
Great, thanks. Yep. David Itano asks, certain fish species and communities are clearly associated to particular substrate types and benthic invertebrates. What is the cutoff between your reference to pelagic species and those eligible for discussion here?
Oof, that's a fantastic question, David. I think it's clear that we have a lot to discuss with the synergies between what the pelagic group will be discussing and what our benthic team will be, or excuse me, biological characterization group will be focused on in the benthic realm. We will keep our minds open to those discussions, so I don't want to say or preemptively shut that down at this point. But I do want to say that we have a lot to focus on, so it's important to capture that and then see where we can essentially draw in the pelagic breakout group in those discussions, and in the final report identify where those connections exist and where they're important for the fisheries species in particular.
Okay, thanks for that. So at this time, we're going to move on to the next breakout session topic, and that's going to be water column characterization as presented by Dr. Mike Vecchione from the NOAA National Systematics Laboratory. Floor is yours.
Thank you. I'm going to start by changing how I plan to start this and mention the questions that were just asked. Yeah, there is a lot of interaction between the pelagic ecosystems and the benthic ecosystems, not just the food that's coming down from the surface, but most of the animals in the benthic ecosystem spend part of their life cycle up in the water column. Also, there's for vertical migrators, when they migrate down close to the bottom, that gets them into a kill zone with the benthic ecosystem. So that there's a lot of interplay that we need to consider, and those are things that we've been talking about in the preliminary discussions for this. And I'm sure that between the biological characterization group and the water column characterization group, we'll be talking about those a lot more and looking for interactions between those groups. So now to what I was going to say, which is, first of all, I was really pleased that the Admiral mentioned the ET sponge description at the beginning of all this, which came out of my lab. But I'm always happy when the deep sea shows up in the news. It's great to get it out into the public arena to increase the realization of the importance of the deep sea and also the interest in it. And many of you may have noticed that another story in the past week has been big in both the news media and in social media. And it involved a paper in PNAS, the Proceedings of National Academies of Science, by Jeff Drazen and a bunch of other co-authors, some of whom are involved in this go-to meeting right now. But it's a group of people that are working on trying to protect ecosystems, deep sea ecosystems, from the effects of deep sea mining. And the point of the PNAS paper was that a lot more attention needs to be paid to the midwater communities and the potential for damage to those communities and our lack of knowledge about those communities. The best visualization of that lack of knowledge that I've seen so far is a paper by Webb et al. From 2010, which was basically part of the wrap up of the Census of Marine Life. The figure that you see here is one of their figures. It's a hypsometric curve, so it's cumulative amount of the ocean at various depths. And what they did was plot the number of OBIS records, the Ocean Biogeographic Information System, records at the end of the Census of Marine Life at various depths in the water column and along the bottom as well, at the various water depths. And the scale there runs from lots and lots of stuff in the red and orange down to nothing at all in the dark blues. And the reason they titled that as Biodiversity's Big Wet Secret was that the point they were making is that the deep water column is chronically underexplored and undercharacterized. And we know very little about what's going on in the deep water column. It's really difficult to do. It's a question of exploring a four-dimensional environment as opposed to when you're working with the bottom, it's essentially two-dimensional. The reason I say it's four-dimensional in the water column is because there's a lot of fairly rapid temporal dynamics going on. And of course, the classic example is vertical migration, which most people think of as a mesopelagic phenomenon, but now we're finding out more and more that vertical migration is going on in the bathypelagic as well as the mesopelagic. The deep water column comprises more than 1 billion cubic kilometers of volume, all of which is occupied and very little of which has been explored. So the classic statement that we know we've explored less than 5% of the deep sea, that refers to the bottom. It's much worse situation in the water column. Now, much as I hate to admit it, water column characterization is not just going down and looking at the animals that are down. There are important drivers that we need to understand that structure the water column and the ecosystem that exists in it. And on the right side of this slide, I gave some examples of some of the drivers that need to be considered when you're thinking about who lives where in the water column kind of questions. And one of the things that I included there was in interactions with the bottom, which addresses the questions that were just asked. But also for a lot of the water column, the interaction is that there is no bottom. So the animals there have a life cycle that is very different than what most people think about. Terrestrial environments are two-dimensional, similar to marine benthic environments. So thinking in terms of 4 dimensions is very alien to most people's experiences. Could I have the next slide, please? Of course, what I'd really like to do is go down and look at the weird animals. The weirder, the better, as far as I'm concerned. But we also get to see unexpected animals and behaviors that we couldn't document any other way other than going down and looking at what the animals are doing for a living. One of the earlier slides mentioned multiple ways of trying to understand and explore what's going on in the deep ocean. And I'm a firm believer in using as many tools as possible. I've done a lot of trawling, and you get a good perspective from trawling, but it's completely different perspective than what you get from exploring with submersibles. And I think you need both of those perspectives and any other, such as acoustics, to really start to understand what's going on in the water column. You do need to collect. There was a comment about trying to get away from collecting, but there is a really strong requirement for collecting, both to get tissue for DNA, but also for details of morphology, internal structure, the reproductive status, and things like that. But there are methods developing that can assist with automated types of observations, such as environmental DNA sampling, where if you have a library of the DNA of the animals that potentially would be there, you can compare what you find in the water column. Next slide, please. One thing we don't want to do is reinvent the wheel. And there was a workshop that was organized by Ocean Exploration in 2017, looking at how to explore the water column. And they put together a very nice report, which is publicly available. It's a NOAA technical memorandum. And I've listed some of their recommendations on the right side of this slide. So what we want to do in our discussions is take these observations and recommendations and build on them rather than just starting from scratch and doing it all over again. I'd like to highlight one, which is dedicated midwater cruises with intensive sampling. Very little of that has ever been done. And essentially, the only place that's been really characterized for deep midwater assemblages is Monterey Canyon. Although there is work going on now with Huey's doing some work in the mesopelagic in the North Atlantic, basically. And the Deepwater Horizon caused a lot of people to rethink the need to understand the water column, since all of the oil from the deep oil spill traveled through the deep pelagic environment. Next slide, please. So for this discussion of water column characterization, Nicole and I have come up with some objectives. These are actually straw man objectives. We're not interested in dictating to the group what they need to talk about. We realize that the participants are some pretty smart people, and they could very well have had some thoughts that haven't drilled their way into my brain yet. So this is basically beginning guidelines for how we want to structure the discussions. We have 2 sessions. So those first 2 categories, identifying data gaps and coming up with strategies, methods, and tools, we plan to talk about during the first session. And then during the second session, we plan to talk about partnerships and regional priorities. I know Nicole is on this call. I don't know if she would like to add anything to this, or if we would just want to open it up to questions and discussion. Nicole?
I think you did a great job, Mike, and welcome any questions.
Thanks, Mike. Thanks, Nicole. We actually do have a few questions for you, so I'll pass it to Katie now.
Thanks, Dan. Thanks, Mike and Nicole. From Chris German, can analyses of eDNA quantify what is not known or recognized in libraries as well?
I think the key to doing eDNA is having really solid library to begin with. But yes, you can recognize things that don't show up in that library. It would be very difficult to say much about what it is, other than that it's something that we don't know. It's what they used to be referred to as the known unknowns, once we have found it with something like DNA.
Great, thanks. From Jamie, we have the WHOI Twilight Zone Initiative capitalizes on private funding to study the 200 to 1,000 meter zone. How should NOAA OER interface with that initiative?
I would love to interface with that initiative. I think a big difference between what we're talking about here and in the several sessions is that the scale of what we are doing is much larger than the focused work that WHOI is doing. So both are very necessary, and I think one informs the other. But if Nicole or somebody else wants to address that, that's okay.
Yes, I would say that I think we can capitalize on some of the tools and sort of methodologies that they're developing and see how they can fit into the national strategy and the programs that are funded through OER.
Great, thanks. Donglai asks, are most of these weird animals in the water column found by chance, or are there effectively ways to actively look for them?
Depends on the abundance, really. Stuff in the water column is pretty spread out. So, this actually gets to what I was saying about needing to use multiple tools, because you're sampling with nets, for instance. You can't get really good specimens, but you can filter a whole lot more water than a submersible can search. So often when I've been interviewed about discovering something weird, a question I get asked is, are you going to go out and have an expedition to go find more of them? And my general answer is no, because right now the status of our knowledge is so poor that I don't think that's a good allocation of resources. That it's better to do the basic exploring and see what we find out at this stage of what we know before we can do focused sampling for something like a big fin squid or something like that. My opinion.
Great. Thanks. Lisa Levin asks, have acoustic data at frequencies that can detect plankton, fish, or bubbles become a standard part of water column exploration data collection?
They are in the work that I've been doing. we depend very heavily on acoustics, and I know that some of the water column work on the West Coast has been very focused towards using acoustics and developing the methods so that they are more useful for both understanding what's going on and understanding the limitations of the more traditional sampling methods.
Yeah, I would say that we definitely have been adding those capabilities and see that this workshop could be a great forum to figure out additional capabilities that could be added to, say, mapping cruises as part of non-delaying work, or even ROV cruises. Some of the work that we're doing as part of the OECI starting next year kind of dovetails into what was asked in the last question about the Twilight Zone. I'm working with the Mesobot and using different acoustic technologies or other water column sampling technologies to help add on those capabilities to other cruises. So a lot of that can be discussed in more detail in our session.
I noticed that Lisa mentioned bubbles in her question. That's a really good point. We're not talking just about biological characterization. We're talking about physical characterization of the water column as well. I've been amazed that the bubbles from the methane seeps show up so well in the acoustics, and it's been a really important, an impressive eye opener for me.
Thank you, everyone. Those have been some really great questions. We realize that there's a few that we have not gotten to yet, but I will remind everybody that we have 15 minutes dedicated after the next break to ask any final questions for the breakout leaders. But at this time, we're going to move on to our final breakout session presentation, and that's going to be on marine resources by Jeremy Potter from BOEM. Pass it to you, Jeremy.
Thanks, Dan. Just setting up my screen a little bit. Mike did a great job of setting up a couple different lines of connections between Midwater and then the marine resources. My name's Jeremy Potter, and I will confess this might be the first day that I've worn a shirt with buttons in months. For Ruth Perry and myself, it's a pleasure to have an opportunity to work with you all over the next few months on behalf of the broad exploration community to make this successful and meaningful workshop. I want to spend the next few minutes briefly presenting the current state of what Ruth and I have been thinking about how to approach marine resources, primarily energy and mineral resources based on the guidance from COL and OER, as well as discussions with the other breakout group leaders. The scope and boundaries, purpose of this breakout group have gone through a number of iterations. We do view this as a community effort, so if anyone has thoughts, advice, constructive criticisms on how to make the 4-hour session more efficient and productive, we are all ears. Feel free to reach out to us anytime. And I admit, when I first put this slide together, I didn't give much thought to the image of a turbine. Offshore wind is not a marine resource in the traditional sense, and wind resources are not something that ocean exploration directly informs. We were about to swap out the image when we realized that maybe it actually provides a much better example than we originally thought. One that captures the scope of marine resources breakout group, but also helps to highlight the direct relevance to management of marine resources of the other breakout groups. So we stuck with it. Here's a bit more context. First, some critical minerals are especially vital for renewable energy technologies, including wind turbines. As noted in many of the white papers, there's much exploration, characterization, and assessment to be done if the nation is to adequately understand the critical marine minerals within the US EEZ. What are the information needs? Where should we look first? And how do we collect that data and information are key considerations for the marine resources breakout group. Second, as opposed to offshore wind projects off the East Coast, potential projects off the West Coast are being discussed in depths greater than 1,000 meters. These floating turbines would be held in place by very large anchoring systems, so deepwater benthic community impacts need to be considered in management decisions. Exploration should play a key role in the identification and characterization of those habitats. Discussions within seafloor characterization, biological characterization, cultural heritage, and midwater groups will be essential to informing the broader applicability of exploration for marine resources at large, which is exactly what I think you just heard from Mike in his reference to midwater and future mining. So that's a long-winded way of saying there's an important distinction between providing information about the resource, about the resource itself versus the surrounding habitat. Both are important to appropriate resource management. Both are applicable to this workshop. The marine resources breakout group will focus more on the resource-specific piece. I'll try to explain that in the next few minutes. These are the two questions that we're really trying to make progress on. They certainly are not mutually exclusive. One is really, what are the marine resource information needs, priority geographies, technologies that exploration can help to address? Second is, what are the partnerships, collaborations that can enhance value or push things forward at a faster pace? Marine resources is obviously a very broad term. We spend a lot of time trying to figure out how many layers of the onion to peel away. This was based on specific guidance from NOAA and COL, as well as our thoughts on how to define things narrowly enough to actually make progress. We also figured that delegating, though some would probably consider pawning off key aspects to the other breakout groups, would help. So the focus of this group is really on what can exploration do to inform knowledge of energy and minerals. Based on guidance from COL, we excluded fisheries resources. We are also excluding sand due to the shallower depths. We expect that there will certainly be some discussion about marine genetic resources, but our assumption is that they will be more of a discussion specific to those in both midwater and biological characterization groups. As mentioned at the beginning, management of energy and mineral resources requires both understanding of the resource as well as the surrounding habitat. So where is the habitat? What is its composition? How much is it worth? Sorry, where are the resources? What is the composition? How much is it worth? For the habitat, what are the habitats in the vicinity of the resource, and how and to what extent could they be impacted by extraction? Exploration certainly doesn't do all of that, but the distinction does provide a pretty good dashed line boundary between the marine resources breakout groups and the other groups. We envision marine resources having a greater focus on what exploration can do to inform understanding of the resource itself, while the other groups, seafloor characterization, midwater, biological characterization, cultural heritage, will be focusing more on exploration and characterization of surrounding habitat. Is there some overlap? Of course, and that's a good thing. We're also planning on a focused discussion on partnerships, what already exists, where are there additional opportunities? We realize that trying to get everyone to agree on a definition of exploration is a rabbit hole that we just don't want to go down. That said, we do need some agreed upon terminology to frame our discussion, and that's what this slide is intended to summarize. We do not expect, nor do we seek consensus on what the definitions, what these definitions are and if they're right. However, we want to use them for our session and make the discussions and deliberations as productive as possible. To appropriately understand the U.S. energy and mineral resource base in the U.S. EEZ, a robust resource assessment is the desired end state. That requires a detailed, systematic field and data analysis effort, very, very far beyond what exploration can or should deliver. The resource characterization piece is a less rigorous interim step and not intended to provide valuation. The goal of our breakout group is to discuss the initial exploration piece and identify where and how it can be done so that exploration can meaningfully inform the follow-on steps. So somewhat redundant, but worth highlighting again. We're planning on 2 separate 2-hour sessions. The first topic, which would extend briefly into the second 2-hour session most likely, is focused on the resource identification and management piece. The 3 questions being, what information is needed, where, and what technology? Second is partnerships. What is already underway? Where are there opportunities? And how can we use a national strategy to our advantage? Though the breakout group members are only hearing about it now, we are planning to start each of the 2 sessions with a few relevant lightning talks. We'll be reaching out to you in the next few weeks, well, in the next week. White papers are obviously a critical part of this workshop, and I'm sure many of you have looked at them already, but want to provide some context about the submissions and how they relate to marine resources. This is my quick and dirty assessment of the relevance of the submissions, both for the COL workshop, but also for the 2014 OET workshop. If you look at the COL webpage, you'll see a map showing all the white paper submissions. If you click on each of the icons, the relevance to the various breakout groups are noted. That said, the marine resources numbers here are a bit more generous than what's shown on the COL website. Of the 45 submissions, 23 include some specific language indicating a relevance to energy or mineral resources. That said, there are certainly additional submissions that were focused on relevant geographies that can provide information about the surrounding habitat that are not included in these numbers. Of the 23, 19 work in the US EEZ, though we will focus most of our discussion during the breakout group on areas within the EEZ, we are including geographic areas in the Pacific outside the EEZ. Of the 23, 11 seem to include some work focused on information about the resource itself, almost all of which were related to critical minerals or hydrates, which is not surprising. Though it's not noted in the table, I do want to call out Lisa Levin's phosphorite submission. Phosphorites were not something that we'd originally been thinking about, but it is certainly an applicable mineral that we should consider in our breakout group. Want to thank in advance all the breakout group members. As I mentioned, Ruth and I will be reaching out to you shortly in preparation for and soliciting feedback on the plans for the marine resources session on July 30th and 31st. So again, Ruth, who's on the phone as well, and I welcome any and all additional inputs and thoughts that you may have to make the breakout session as meaningful as possible. Thank you.
Thank you, Jeremy. And I commend you for finishing exactly on time as according to the agenda. That was impressive. So what we're going to do at this point is we'll go ahead and take our 15-minute break as scheduled. And when we come back at 4 o'clock, we'll start the official Q&A session with a few of the marine resources focused questions from the participants. And we'll also address questions for the other breakout leaders that you may think of in the next 15 minutes. So at this time, let's go ahead and adjourn for a break, and we'll plan for everyone to meet back here just after 4 o'clock Eastern. Thank you.
Hi, this is Chris Sholin. I have a question.
Hey, go ahead, Chris.
I was just curious on the seafloor characterization, that the priority list, I didn't see explicitly geohazards. I think it was there implicitly, but I was just curious if there could be some commentary about specifically looking at offshore seismic hazards and tsunami. And I'm thinking in particularly Cascadia margin and the hazard that poses for people living near it.
Yeah, let me chime in from the seafloor characterization session perspective. This is there's been a sidebar discussion going on, and it started with Vicky's question about sub-bottom and should it be included. And I think it's one of these things I think that kind of fell between the cracks between what we thought the mineral resources people or the resources people would cover and what we would cover. So I think we're trying to come to grips with that and find certainly a place for, it would be really sub-bottom for the most part, although hazards can go beyond that, both from the water column perspective in terms of gas structures, but sub-bottom would be a key feature of a hazards issue too. So I think the session leads will have a discussion, and I will promise we'll find a place for it somewhere.
Great. Thanks, Chris, and thanks, Larry. So we'll go ahead and get started again. We do have a couple of marine resources focused questions that we'll pose to Jeremy. So Katie, if you're ready for that, go ahead.
Thanks, Dan. Yep. So Jim Kendall had a couple of questions. What could you call basic research conducted in a part of the ocean where little is known? What could you call applied research conducted in a part of the ocean where there is limited information to support a resource management decision? What could you call a survey of the seafloor to determine if there is anything there which needs to be protected or preserved? How about exploration? So one's research, basic or applied, is another's exploration. Another's survey is someone else's exploration, and so forth.
I guess I'm not sure if Jim really wanted me to try to address that. It might be more of an issue, something to be addressed by Jamie or Alan. I think the way that we've been approaching this, the scope and what we try to accomplish is largely based on our impression of what OER, how OER views exploration, right? It is different to different people, but generally the OER, this is a workshop that is funded and to inform OER, but also others. And so that's kind of how we're trying to put bounds around how we approach this.
You know, Jeremy, Jim, some of this might be dictated by the kinds of partnerships that evolve. You know, we get closer to that with resources and to a degree with cultural heritage than we do in any other way. I don't want to preconceive it, and I don't want to get stuck in the semantics of definitions, and I think Jeremy said that. We're certainly in the business of trying to push the bounds of the unknown. Resources, you know, we're not Shell. We are not a resource extraction company. We are not ever going to think about it in those terms. So I like a big definition of exploration, but we don't want to be in the business of going beyond pushing a boundary of what is known too far into either hypothesis-driven science, which is the purview of other federal agencies, or commercial firms.
All right, great, thank you. So Chris Sholin asks for the marine resources leads. To what extent is conservation environmental impact analysis included in your vision for the group discussion / reporting?
Let's see. So it's a great question, Chris. Appropriate management, resource management in consideration of any mining or resource extraction obviously has to take into account the environmental impact analysis, right? I think through exploration is kind of the broad definition Jamie just described, can only do a part of that, right? It's not, I don't think OER is intending that exploration is going to include plume studies, right? If about potential marine mineral extraction and what that would mean for plumes in the water column. However, what are the organisms that live in those environments? That is key to exploration, and it is also something that is key to being able to perform down the road a appropriate environmental impact analysis. So I think in terms of the broad workshop and all the various groups, there is a lot of information related to marine resources that will be helpful down the road for developing an impact analysis, a lot of that will actually be beyond the scope of the resources group specifically, because I think a lot of that would be in the midwater, seafloor, and biological characterizations, kind of along the lines that Mike Vecchione described at the very end of his talk. Does that kind of help? I don't know if any of the other breakout group leaders have thoughts for or against that. Please speak up.
You know, in light of the discussions we've had, we may schedule one more meeting of breakout leaders before the first session to cover any bases like fuzziness, boundary fuzziness that we still think we should talk about.
Great, thanks, Jeremy, and thanks, Jamie. Right now, at this point, we don't have additional questions that are marine resources focused. So at this time, I want to invite everyone to submit questions that they might have thought of after the previous breakout leader presentations. So if you have questions on any of the other topics, we do have some time dedicated right now to address those again. While you're thinking of your questions and typing them in the chat, Jamie, I know you had a comment that you'd like to make given NOAA OER budgets and the 200-meter depth issue.
Yeah, you know, we have had some interest, and there is obviously scientific importance to shallow water things, Beringia, movement of cultural history / resources during the last ice age and so on. But I've been reminded that given we would all love bigger budgets, and we're part of the goal of this workshop is to envision a world with bigger budgets. But the budget we have is on the order of $40 million. And historically, what we have concentrated, what NOAA OER has concentrated on has been the slice of ocean big enough, deeper than 200 meters. And I remind all the breakout leaders that we've got two focuses here. The primary focus is to guide NOAA OER and what we will do next in the Pacific. That simply must be focused primarily, almost exclusively, on water depths deeper than 200 meters. As you think about the world of larger resources and a national global program of ocean exploration, we might be thinking about expanding that to shallower water, but that's not our primary focus. Just wanted to make that clear.
Thanks, Jamie. And I see that Katie John White has a question, and maybe we can open that up to any of the breakout leaders who are interested in answering or addressing that.
Great, sounds good, thanks. John's question is, the proven ability of many in this group to advance and operationalize new capabilities such as eDNA excites me. Are there specific Fed programs or concepts that you know of, for example, NOP, Other Transaction Authority, ARPA-O, that might help catalyze this on a grander or more coordinated scale?
This is Chris Scholl, and I can comment if you'll let me.
Of course, go ahead, Chris.
There are a number of groups who are in contact, who are actively working in the eDNA space and pushing to completely automate that process from sample acquisition all the way to data dissemination. And it is not something that any single group is really perfectly positioned to do alone. It's going to be a village, kind of classic, takes a village. So we're trying to pull together a group with industry, some national lab type capabilities, and we think this is an ideal project for an organization like DARPA. So we're in discussion with program officer there, but it's been a priority that was set for NOP, and proposals were submitted, but NOP did not fund those proposals. So we're working on it. I think if we can use some of the requirements definition that come out of this to help push a program like NOP to take that step, then there are people who are ready to get the job done.
Okay, and I believe we have a question for Larry and David in regards to the seafloor characterization breakout.
Yes, thank you. Beth Orchid asks, for the sampling scope, do you envision that in situ sensors would also be a part of the scope in addition to traditional sampling?
I think we actually had that question before, and David replied to it. And I think the answer is that, again, because seafloor characterization has such a broad scope, it could have incorporated everything we've seen up here today. Just about, we tried to limit it, and so the in situ sampling aspects are going to be covered under the water column, under the marine resources areas, and the biological characterization areas, we hope. And again, I think, as Jamie pointed out, it's probably time after this discussion for the breakout session leaders to get back together and make sure that we have really carved out the boundaries properly.
Thanks, Larry. Jan Rolotto is asking if we could address again Lisa Levin's question, if acoustic data includes frequencies to detect and quantify zooplankton and fish sampling in the water column as a part of exploration.
I guess maybe a better answer, a more clear answer is I think we need to discuss that further in our groups and see what additional groups have sensors or instruments platforms that we should be using more routinely on exploration cruises. So I think right now we know we're not doing a great job at characterizing midwater as ocean explorers, and that there are scientists and researchers who are developing these tools, and we should be seeking out partnerships with them to and testing them out and seeing which ones we can apply more to our expeditions.
All right, I see another question here from Sebastian. In planning for the strategy execution, what role partnership is envisioned with the Navy in the current context, for example, NavOcean and other DoD agencies?
You know, I think there's some outstanding examples of continuing partnerships with the Navy in Jim Delgado and Search and the cultural heritage efforts, Vulcan. I mean, we've got wonderful examples of continuing partnerships with the Navy. I think it's up to the breakout groups to continue to explore what the other entities interested in the oceans can provide NOAA OER. Jim, you want to say more?
I think we still have Bob Nayland on from Navy History and Heritage Command. And while those of us in the maritime archaeology and heritage communities do work closely with them, I know that there will probably be some other ways in which Navy would be interested. And my hope is that we'll probably see a few more of them as this proceeds. Bob, if you're on, please pass that along upstairs at the NHHC.
Great, thanks. Donglei says, thinking longer term and certainly not limited to just the Pacific, how do we envision making ocean exploration more sustainable? Meaning utilizing more renewable energy sources for platforms, utilizing more autonomy, effectively increasing exploration per dollar.
Excellent question. I don't know the answer.
If I can comment, this is Sebastian.
The big funders of science have been the federal government. We've had a wonderful exponent of citizen science on the Ocean Exploration Advisory Board for several years, David Lang. I think expanding the user base is one way we expand exploration. We can expand the funding for NOAA OER, but that's only one way we expand exploration. More people thinking about exploration, thinking about the oceans, expanding within their communities. Amanda's point about reaching out to other countries that have got interest in exploration is another aspect of this. It's a complicated topic, and one we could probably run our own workshop on.
Great. Well, thank you everyone for your questions.
On this is Sebastian. I really like the question.
Sebastian, we're not hearing you if you are talking.
Sorry, I was just waiting for authorization to speak, but I guess I would say what I was going to say, which is I really like the previous question on sustainability. On such a large scale effort, I think this is a unique opportunity to reinvent some of the technologies that can further the exploration. And this is what we have done as a group, not just as technologists at Saildrone, but with a lot of our financial backers to try to imagine how wind and solar propelled solution can achieve not only sustainability goals, which are also important, societal goals, whilst decreasing the cost per square mile explored or mapped in different ways. And I think that just the fact that we have this group together here should allow us to explore those topics and bring more ideas to this realm, because the current way of doing it, it's not just a question of sustainability, but also of cost, given the magnitude.
I just follow real quickly, and something that we addressed or at least attempted to introduce in the biological characterization is improving efficient exploration and characterization of the biological communities using a variety of different new technologies, including artificial intelligence and machine learning to automate image analysis to better process information that we gather from the seafloor more quickly, so we can get the data to the users in a quick way. So that's one example where we're looking at trying to improve efficiencies so we can maximize each dollar spent and minute that's explored on the seafloor.
Thank you, Sebastian. Thank you, Amanda. These are great conversations and obviously ones that we want to continue. And we encourage everyone to, again, email your breakout leaders, email Jamie, email your fellow breakout session participants. All of you should have everyone else's email addresses sent to you by Katie earlier this week. And we want you to have these conversations offline outside of the workshop hours to bring those into the breakout sessions and in the concluding session in September. But at this time, we're going to move on to the next item on the agenda. Dr. Jamie Austin will elaborate on something that he touched upon earlier, which is inclusive and equitable partnerships in the Pacific and beyond. So Jamie, we'll get your slideshow up.
Great.
There it is, and the floor is yours.
Yeah, I've been set up a little bit for this by Amanda and Jim and Lisa and others. And I want to say at the outset, as an old white guy, that I am not giving this talk as someone who is purveying wisdom on this subject, but I am reminding everyone that as we move forward, this kind of conversation is something we simply must incorporate in all our discussions. Next slide, Dan. A little historical perspective and a renewed national focus on what I call DE&I, diversity, equity, and inclusion. We're all aware, painfully so, of recent examples of racial injustice in the United States and how much it's galvanized the public. It's been leading to strident calls for increased awareness and the need for change. And it's increasingly clear that science and everything we do in science has got to be part of that awareness. we've got good news as far as NOAA OER is concerned. We've consistently incorporated DE&I perspectives into our thinking and operations. We've got multiple examples. There was the publication of the All Hands on Deck report, and the URL is here. And again, these PowerPoints will be available for everyone. That came out as part of the 2018 National Ocean Exploration Forum. OET, Bob Ballard, Nicole Reno and company have always showcased DE&I in all aspects of OET operations, its presence overall, operations and staffing, and bravo for that. Something Dr. Ballard has always been very, very much supportive of. The Ocean Exploration Advisory Board is developing a position statement on DE&I for NOAA leadership. Amanda Demopoulos and Dominique Rissolo of OEAB are in the process of putting that together. And the just published national strategy for mapping, exploration, and characterization in the US EEZ points to the value of enhancing inclusion in ocean exploration, and that's specifically in section 5.3 of that national strategy. But now for the cautionary note, you know, Pete Gerges at Harvard just gave a talk recently at a NSF-funded workshop that Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution conducted. And he's recently called a lack of diversity in science unacceptable at every level, leading to what he calls compromised science. And I urge everyone to grab hold of that talk. It's a really good talk. And the simple fact is, Admiral White likes to use the term shareholder rather than stakeholder, and I'm using that here because I think we're all shareholders in this. We've simply got to include a wide variety of communities, whether we call them underrepresented minorities in STEM and ocean science, members of small island nations, indigenous populations in Alaska, in future OE activities and initiatives in the Pacific and elsewhere. Next slide, Dan. You know, and we were aware of this as we began to plan for this plenary, and we were originally going to include a DE&I discussion panel to raise awareness on this topic, how OE shareholders could engage and incorporate underrepresented communities into our ongoing work in the Pacific and beyond as we envision a national effort. We sought appropriate panelists, we worked on discussion topics, and then we realized we ultimately were not going to do the kind of job we could do. The time was too short. The overall topic was too important to do potential harm with inadequate lip service to a subject that requires a vital and continuing discussion. So the organizers now ask in this plenary that the topic instead be included to the degree that all of the breakout groups deem it possible over the next couple of months to consider these questions. What engagement strategies will these communities are necessary and appropriate as Pacific exploration moves forward? Do we have successful engagement strategies that exist, for example? And which elements of these strategies can be applied ultimately to some kind of a national OE program should one develop? Our overall intent now is to use the breakout discussions to help us put together a panel. We've got some excellent people already in mind, but if breakout discussion groups have others in mind, let us know, for a more substantive discussion of this topic during the September plenary. Dominique Rissolo, for example, at UC San Diego is a member of the OEAB, is very knowledgeable, has been very successful in this arena. He could not attend this plenary, but he's very interested in helping us in September. And we hope that results of all the discussions on this topic be included in the final report. So next slide, I'll just take comments and questions on this and we can open it up. I am not purveying myself to be an oracle of wisdom on this, but we did want you to be aware that we were aware of the topic, that we're sympathetic to it, but we simply did not feel we could do it justice in the time allotted today.
Thanks, Jamie. And we'll give everyone who might be interested in asking a question just a minute to type it to the organizers in the chat.
And Dan, you might as well queue up the final, my final 2 slides, and I can be talking about that while people are thinking about the rest.
Great, will do. And Alex is going to get that up for you.
Yeah, so it falls to me to remind everyone that we are now in an extended collective consciousness on Pacific planning. I think this opening plenary has gone extraordinarily well. Believe me, we lived in fear of virtual chaos today, and it's been just the opposite. We've got over 70 people online, and you've all been extraordinarily cooperative in helping us make this a constructive effort, being orderly with questions and so on. And I, again, tip my hat to all of the COL team for the job that they have done. This is going seamlessly because a lot of people have put a lot of thought into this. And Dan, Katie, Alex, Haley, Admiral White, thank you very much. I remind everyone that we, over the next month or so, we will have 5 breakout discussions. We have, they are on your slide, we have allocated about a dozen people from the participants list to each of these discussions, and you know who you are. I show you the dates for those. We decided ultimately to schedule 2 2-hour pieces rather than scheduling 1 4-hour slice, which ultimately we felt might lead to battle fatigue. You see the dates. We hope that by mid-August, we will have an initiative going among all 5 groups to get internal discussions going after the initial group discussions on draft breakout reports, which we hope will be available in time for the closing virtual plenary in mid-September. I encourage all of the breakout leaders to be thinking out of the box on how you want to run your smaller groups. A dozen people is not so big that you can't have beyond these scheduled discussions, offline discussions. You can form subgroups, you can do whatever you want to pursue emerging technologies, partnerships, and approaches to your topic. And I encourage you to do that. We at COL and myself will help you every way we can, but it's going to be up to you now, each of the breakout team leaders, to fashion a strategy that is most beneficial to you. We will probably have one more meeting before the first July 22nd virtual breakout discussion by Jim Cameron and company on cultural heritage to revisit today's conversation and make sure that we have dotted I's and crossed T's on any questions that have arisen. For example, the issue of sub-bottom characterization. I have said before, I'll say again, that our mid-September closing plenary will be virtual now. We simply don't know enough about where our pandemic is going to plan for an in-person strategy. We may plan sometime between that closing plenary and publication of the report to get a small group together, perhaps the breakout co-leads or a subset of those co-leads with me and with COL to actually put the report together. But we simply don't know that now, and we'll have to keep you informed as we know more. And with that, we'll open it up to a final Q&A. Thank you.
Thanks, Jamie. So we do have a couple of questions and comments related to the diversity issue that you addressed. So we're going to start by focusing on those. At this time, we also open the chat box for questions just about logistics for the workshop over the next couple of months. But we'll start with the diversity issue.
Let me answer Amy Bako-Taylor's question first. Can we attend more than one breakout? Yes. We are limiting the breakout discussions to those participants that have been assigned as participants, as we did today, but observers to breakout discussions are encouraged. And to the degree that you want to allocate time to these discussions over the next month, we encourage your participation, and we welcome it. So that's a question there.
Thanks, Jamie. This is Katie. I'll just add for all of the participants and observers, if there's a session that you're interested in particular in observing, please send Dan and myself an email so we can add you to that list.
Cameron Hume, the co-chair of the Cultural Heritage Session, says, are all panels diversified? You know, if there is someone, we encourage the breakout co-leads in all cases to identify panelists that we might not have identified to add breadth and depth to their discussion. So I fire back at you, Mr. Ambassador. If you see someone, or you or Jim see someone in cultural heritage that you think is important to diversify your discussion, I encourage you to add that person. We can't make these groups too big, but we have room to make them a little bigger.
Thanks, Jamie. And just to tag on that, Lisa Levin had asked if there was a tally of the diversity represented in the 45 white paper submissions. We have not done that analysis at this point, but we certainly can. And thank you very much for bringing that point up. And Kristen Urincic had a question also related to the D&I topic. Diversity is a concern for the ocean science workforce overall. OE is a great engager and tool to improve this. Any thoughts on how this workshop can address that? And we can toss that to Jamie, and we can toss that to the participants here today as well.
Well, as a quick, Kristen and company at COL have been working on the implications of OE and other activities for the workforce. Kristen has statistics on this, which I decided we didn't have time to share today. But I think as we envision a larger discussion on this, beyond the breakout discussions to a panel and a more substantive subject or a breakout on this in September, we will certainly bring workforce implications of this into play.
Great. And as we continue to get questions, I'll just request that if you're going to ask a question in the chat, just please address who you would like the question asked to, if you have someone specific in mind. But noting that, I'll pass back to Katie to address more of the questions that we have now.
Thanks, Dan. Yeah, Janet Watt says, can we work a discussion of marine geohazard characterization into one of the breakout groups more explicitly? And I'll toss that to our breakout session leaders. Perhaps we can discuss that following this plenary in more detail.
Yeah, in response, I think you know, we have heard that geohazard input. We acknowledge it. It crosses breakout discussion boundaries, and it's something the breakout leads need to discuss, and we will do our best to incorporate it.
I don't see any other questions in the chat at this time, but we'll give folks a few more minutes.
I encourage everybody who's attended the plenary. We had done a pretty good job of identifying important DE&I players. We asked people in Alaska, we asked people like Dominic Risolo, who've done a lot of work with the Polynesian Islanders, to give us representatives. We got some excellent people. We just decided we didn't have time to crystallize a set of discussion points for that panel to address, and we did not want to do the job badly. But I encourage everybody thinking about it today to give us names of possible panelists, to give us discussion points, to identify engagement strategies you may know about that have been successful. I know people like Amanda are going to build this into their discussions, but feel free to email me, feel free to email the COL organizers. We are going to have a piece of the report dedicated to DE&I and the importance of DE&I for the Pacific and a national OE program. Count on it.
Looks like we've got a few more comments in the chat, and Katie, would you mind presenting those to the group?
Sure, sounds good, thanks. Jenny Waddell says, coastal treaty tribes in Washington state have interests in this topic. Peter Edwards said, I think it's important to keep this topic throughout each of the breakout groups. And Jenny followed up, they have treaty protected rights in the marine environment and management responsibilities.
Yeah, so Jenny, it's an excellent point. We've been thinking about Alaska, and that's certainly that was a centerpiece of the presidential memorandum, and we've been thinking about Polynesia. But if you have someone in the state of Washington representing the indigenous component or peoples there, and you think that would be interactive in a panel like this, I'd love to know about it, or him or her. So let me know.
Great. Well, thank you, everyone. Katie, do we have any other questions or comments to address at this time?
Nope. Thanks, everybody, for your questions, for your comments throughout today.
Great. So, Jamie, we'll give it to you to provide any closing remarks, and then John White would also like to follow up with a few closing remarks.
Yeah, let me first thank all of you. Any 4-hour meeting anytime is not easy, even with breaks. And when you can go out and chat over coffee, it's a lot nicer. So staring at little postage stamps of your colleagues on a screen that's not much bigger than a book, which is what we're all doing here, is above and beyond the call of duty. Your commitment to this, your knowledge, your breadth of knowledge, your interest, your interaction is just inspiring to me. And I want to thank you all. I also think I've been involved, Larry and Bob Ballard got me involved in the Ocean Exploration Advisory Working Group back in 2004, and it's 2020 now. And we're still fighting. We are fighting a battle to keep OE as a centerpiece, and we're all convinced that it has to be. There are societal implications to it now that are even more important than they were 16 years ago when I got involved, but our budgets are still inadequate. Having said that, we have a glorious opportunity now. We have the ear of agencies, we have the ear of the executive branch of the government, and I think we have an excellent opportunity to see budgets increase. And I think this workshop is in a great position to capitalize on that opportunity to help blueprint what we do with resources should resources be augmented. And I want to thank Alan too. Alan Leonardi's been a wonderful custodian of ocean exploration in the time that he's been head of OER. The OECI, the Cooperative Institute that Larry and Bob and others are involved in, is a great example of capitalizing on those resources to pursue partnerships, technologies, to build diversity and equity and inclusion. These are all positive steps, but we need more resources. So we're all pushing for that. Your interest and participation here is a great piece of that puzzle, and I just can't thank you enough. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Jamie. And before we pass to John for final closing remarks, I know that Katie and I have been working with a lot of you over the last few months, and started out booking hotel rooms and flights. And here we are several months later in a go-to meeting. And so again, we just really appreciate everyone's flexibility. And I know that a lot of you have been working hard on developing content for the workshop, and we appreciate that. And we look forward to working with all of you in the breakout sessions that are coming up over the next couple of months. And if anybody has any questions or concerns or issues, please feel free to email Katie and I. We'll work with you for any issues that might come up. So we definitely welcome that. So with that, I'll pass it to John to close out the meeting. Thank you.
So Dan, thank you. Thanks again, the entire gang at COL for your hard work. And certainly thank you, Jamie, for your leadership and work here. A lot of hard effort. I also want to know, I'll say a lot of you did white papers. You have worked hard in terms of putting together the breakout sessions. Probably a lot more work than you might have thought you were signing up for. I don't know. But I think this is very important. So I want to thank all of you as well. I want to address one question earlier on that was talked about. What's the involvement of Navy here? I know there were a couple of Navy folks, both from the research side and the operational side, who had signed up for this. I don't think they're still on. If they are, please feel free to yell, scream, or whatever. But I think, I know certainly I'm a little bit concerned. I know I'm on Gaudet, and I've talked about this. We need more Navy focus here. There are incredible national security and maritime security implications of all this work, of all of these sessions. So we're going to go off on and redouble our efforts, but I encourage all of you who have relationships with the Navy to reach out to them as well. I will, but if there's anything that is less loved than a grumpy admiral is a retired grumpy admiral. So they probably don't want to hear from me. They'd much rather hear from you. But anyway, I'm going to do that. We need them in this game. So I'll just leave you with that one point. The final thing that I want to say is, again, I go back to the great comments, you, Jamie, Alan Leon on the DEI thing. And I go back to, again, being inspired by Bob Ballard. Thank you. Many years, your efforts and the efforts of Ocean Exploration Trust and many of the foundations involved in this to try to increase our overall diversity have been incredible. And I think we can learn a lot from those and move forward in this in the days to come. So feel free to send, again, any thoughts, any ideas, experiences, failures, and lessons learned, very important. But if you send those to us as well, we'll be happy to actually take those on board and get those into both the working groups and final plenary. And with that, again, I just say, I think, as far as I'm concerned, this is the best go-to meeting I've ever gone to. So thanks for all of your efforts and work. We're done.